For much of European antiquity, the ancestors of the Slavs remained outside the attention of written history. Classical authors did not name them, imperial chroniclers did not govern them, and no early inscriptions record their self-identification. Yet archaeological and linguistic evidence demonstrates that long before their sudden appearance in 6th century texts, Slavic-speaking communities had already developed within a specific environmental and geographic framework in Eastern Europe. This section examines where that development most likely occurred and how landscape, climate, and subsistence shaped early Proto-Slavic society. Most modern scholarship places the Proto-Slavic homeland within the broad forest steppe zone of Eastern Europe, bounded approximately by the Vistula River to the west, the Dnieper River to the east, and the Pripyat marshlands to the north, with southern extensions toward the Middle Danube basin. Chronologically, this developmental phase is generally situated between 1500 and 500 BCE, though precise dating remains debated due to the absence of written records and the gradual nature of cultural change. The region itself was defined by dense forests, river networks, wetlands, and fertile soils, offering a stable environment for mixed agriculture and pastoral activity. Archaeologists have associated early Proto-Slavic populations with several material culture complexes rather than a single unified culture. Among the most frequently discussed are the Lusatian culture, c. 1300 to 500 BCE, the Milograd culture, c. 700 BCE 100 CE, and the later Zarabansi culture, c. 200 BCE 200 CE. These archaeological groupings are not universally accepted as exclusively Slavic, but they provide valuable insight into settlement patterns and economic behavior consistent with later Slavic societies. Excavations reveal small, unfortified villages located near rivers and arable land, indicating reliance on local resources rather than long-distance control. Settlement remains typically consist of modest dwellings constructed from timber and earth, often semi-subterranean in form. These structures provided insulation against cold winters and suggest year-round occupation rather than seasonal migration. Storage pits, agricultural tools, and grinding stones indicate cereal cultivation, including millet and barley, supplemented by animal husbandry and hunting. Archaeological layers show continuity rather than disruption, implying gradual development without evidence of large-scale invasion or elite dominance. Material culture from these sites is notably uniform and understated. Pottery tends to be handmade, undecorated, and functional, with little evidence of luxury goods or social stratification. Burial practices, where identifiable, lack rich grave offerings, reinforcing the impression of relatively egalitarian communities. This absence of elite markers contrasts with neighboring societies such as the Hallstatt and Latine cultures to the west or Scythian groups to the south, whose archaeological signatures include weapon burials and prestige items. Linguistic evidence further supports a forest steppe origin. Reconstruction of Proto-Slavic vocabulary reveals a shared lexicon heavily oriented toward woodland environments, river systems, and temperate agriculture. Terms for trees such as oak, birch, and pine, as well as words for wetlands, meadows, and freshwater fish, appear consistently across later Slavic languages. At the same time, the absence of early loanwords related to Mediterranean agriculture or seafaring suggests limited contact with southern or maritime cultures during this formative period. Comparative linguistics also places Proto-Slavic within the Balto-Slavic branch of Indo-European, with divergence occurring gradually rather than through sudden migration. Phonological consistency across Slavic languages indicates prolonged internal cohesion, which is difficult to reconcile with models proposing rapid displacement from distant homelands. This linguistic stability aligns closely with archaeological evidence for long-term habitation within a relatively stable geographic zone. Scholarly debate continues regarding whether Proto-Slavic culture emerged primarily through autochthonous development or as the result of population movement and cultural synthesis. Some researchers emphasize continuity from earlier Bronze Age cultures in the region, while others point to interaction with Iranian, Germanic, and Baltic neighbors as catalysts for ethnogenesis. Current consensus favors a model of gradual cultural formation shaped by regional interaction rather than mass migration or conquest. Importantly, no single archaeological culture can be definitively labeled Proto-Slavic. Instead, The homeland must be understood as a cultural and ecological zone, in which related communities shared economic practices, linguistic features, and social structures over many centuries. This diffuse origin explains why the Slavs entered written history abruptly and already numerous, without clear evidence of centralized authority or sudden expansion. By the late 1st millennium BCE, communities within this forest steppe homeland had developed subsistence strategies, settlement continuity, and linguistic cohesion that would later support rapid demographic growth. As environmental adaptation stabilized daily life, these populations were positioned to respond effectively to external pressures and opportunities. As environmental conditions shaped early communities, internal social organization began to take clearer and more durable forms. Before continuing, viewers who wish to follow future installments in this series may subscribe to the channel and enable notifications for daily Nightfall history documentaries. You are also invited to leave a comment noting the section or theme you found most informative. The Slavs existed as a people before they existed as a name. Long before medieval chroniclers identified Slavic groups across Eastern and Central Europe, linguistic evidence indicates the presence of a shared speech community that had already developed internal cohesion. This section examines how the Proto-Slavic language emerged within the Indo-European family and how linguistic unity functioned as the primary marker of identity in the absence of political institutions or written self-description. Proto-Slavic is generally classified within the Balto-Slavic branch of Indo-European, sharing numerous phonological and morphological features with early Baltic languages. Comparative linguistic analysis suggests that Balto-Slavic divergence began during the Late Bronze Age, approximately between 1500 and 1000 BCE, though exact dating remains imprecise. Shared sound changes, such as similar vowel developments and accentuation patterns, indicate a prolonged period of contact and gradual differentiation rather than abrupt separation. Within this framework, Proto-Slavic emerged as a distinct linguistic system by the early 1st millennium BCE. Linguists have reconstructed a relatively uniform phonology and grammar across later Slavic languages, pointing to an extended phase of internal stability. This unity is notable given the large geographic area later occupied by Slavic-speaking populations. The consistency of core vocabulary related to kinship, agriculture, tools, and natural features supports the conclusion that Proto-Slavic speakers remained in close and continuous interaction over centuries. Reconstructed Proto-Slavic vocabulary offers insight into the environment and social organization of its speakers. Words for forest vegetation, rivers, wetlands, domesticated animals, and temperate climate farming are prominent, aligning closely with archaeological evidence from the forest steppe zone of Eastern Europe. At the same time, early Proto-Slavic lacks extensive maritime terminology or vocabulary associated with Mediterranean agriculture, reinforcing the view that linguistic development occurred inland and away from major urban civilizations. The absence of early Slavic ethnonyms in classical sources has long posed a challenge for historians. Roman and Greek authors such as Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, and Ptolemy mention peoples inhabiting regions later associated with Slavs, but they do not identify them by a clear Slavic name. Instead, these authors refer to groups such as the Veneti, whose precise ethnic affiliation remains debated. Most scholars now agree that these labels reflected external geographic categorization rather than self-identified ethnicity. This lack of naming does not indicate the absence of identity. Rather, it reflects the non-state and decentralized character of early Slavic society. Without centralized leadership, urban centers, or written administration, identity was maintained through shared language, customs, and local traditions rather than through political institutions. In such contexts, linguistic cohesion functioned as the primary mechanism of cultural continuity. Early ethnogenesis among the Slavs therefore differed significantly from that of contemporary state-based societies. Identity was not expressed through royal dynasties, territorial borders, or monumental architecture, but through everyday social interaction and mutual intelligibility. Linguistic unity allowed dispersed communities to maintain cultural coherence, even as they adapted to local environments and neighboring influences. Records from late antiquity provide indirect confirmation of this process. By the 6th century CE, Byzantine authors such as Procopius of Caesarea and Jordanes describe Slavic-speaking groups as culturally similar despite their wide distribution. These chroniclers noted common customs, shared religious practices, and mutual comprehension, suggesting that linguistic unity preceded and enabled later demographic expansion rather than resulting from it. Archaeological evidence complements this picture. Material culture across early Slavic regions shows regional variation but retains a consistent underlying simplicity in settlement structure and domestic tools. This pattern aligns with a model in which language, rather than elite material culture, served as the unifying element across communities. Linguistic cohesion allowed social norms and practices to be transmitted effectively without centralized enforcement. Over time, this shared linguistic foundation facilitated rapid communication and integration as Slavic populations expanded during the early medieval period. Because language already provided a common framework, new settlements could form without the need for imposed authority or cultural replacement. This continuity explains how Slavic groups could spread across large territories while maintaining recognizable cultural similarity. By the end of the first millennium BCE, Proto-Slavic had become a stable and cohesive linguistic system embedded within a network of related communities. Although these populations remained unnamed in historical texts, their shared language constituted a durable form of identity. Linguistic unity thus established the conditions under which broader social organization would later emerge, supporting the expansion and differentiation that followed in subsequent centuries. Early Slavic society left few monuments, but it displayed strong and enduring social continuity. Archaeological evidence from the forest steppe regions of Eastern Europe indicates that early Slavic communities were organized around small, stable villages supported by flexible subsistence strategies and kin-based social structures. These features shaped a society that emphasized collective decision-making and local autonomy rather than centralized authority. Settlement patterns associated with early Slavic populations typically consist of small villages located near rivers, floodplains, and arable land. Excavated sites reveal clusters of dwellings rather than nucleated towns, suggesting communities structured around extended families or clan groups. These villages rarely show signs of defensive walls or monumental construction, indicating that social cohesion and environmental adaptation were prioritized over territorial display. One of the most distinctive architectural features of early Slavic settlements is the widespread use of semi-subterranean dwellings, commonly referred to as polyazemlyanki. These structures were partially dug into the ground, with timber frameworks and earthen walls. Archaeologists uncovered hearths, storage pits, and domestic tools within these dwellings, indicating year-round occupation. The design provided insulation during winter and cooling during warmer months, reflecting a practical response to regional climate rather than social hierarchy. The internal uniformity of these dwellings is notable. Houses within the same settlement are similar in size and construction, with no clear differentiation that would indicate elite residences. This pattern contrasts sharply with contemporaneous societies in Central and Southern Europe, where elite compounds, fortified hilltops, and wealthier burials are common. Among early Slavic communities, architectural evidence supports a broadly egalitarian social structure, at least in material terms. Subsistence strategies further reinforce this interpretation. Early Slavic agriculture relied heavily on slash-and-burn cultivation, a method well suited to forested environments. Fields were cleared, cultivated for several seasons, and then allowed to regenerate while communities shifted cultivation elsewhere. Archaeobotanical evidence indicates the cultivation of cereals such as millet, barley, and rye, supplemented by legumes and gathered wild plants. This agricultural system required collective labor and local coordination rather than centralized management. Animal husbandry played a complementary role. Zooarchaeological remains demonstrate the presence of cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, with seasonal herding patterns adjusted to local terrain. Livestock provided meat, dairy products, hides, and traction, reducing reliance on long-distance trade. Hunting and fishing remained important supplementary activities, particularly in riverine and forest environments, contributing to dietary diversity and resilience. Social organization within these communities appears to have been structured around kinship networks rather than formal political offices. While direct evidence of governance mechanisms is limited, The absence of elite markers suggests leadership roles were situational and temporary, likely emerging during periods of conflict or collective decision-making. Consensus-based assemblies, inferred from later Slavic traditions, may have functioned at the village level to coordinate agricultural cycles, defense, and dispute resolution. Burial practices offer additional insight. Early Slavic cemeteries, where identifiable, tend to be modest and lack significant differentiation in grave goods. Cremation and inhumation both appear, depending on region and period, but neither shows consistent association with wealth or rank. This stands in contrast to neighboring Germanic and steppe societies, where weapon burials and elaborate grave goods signaled social status and lineage. Material culture reflects similar restraint. Pottery, tools, and household items are utilitarian and locally produced, with limited evidence of specialization. The lack of luxury imports suggests that early Slavic communities were largely self-sufficient and oriented toward subsistence stability rather than surplus accumulation. Trade existed but did not dominate daily economic life during this phase. These social and economic arrangements produced communities capable of adaptive mobility without cultural disruption. Seasonal movement for agriculture, grazing, or resource gathering did not undermine social cohesion, as kinship and language provided continuity. This flexibility reduced vulnerability to localized environmental stress and allowed populations to expand gradually into adjacent territories. By the early centuries CE, early Slavic society had developed a durable social model characterized by small-scale organization, economic adaptability, and collective governance. These features did not produce centralized states or monumental architecture, but they fostered demographic stability and cultural resilience. As external pressures intensified in late antiquity, these flexible communities were positioned to respond rapidly, laying the groundwork for broader expansion in the centuries that followed. Rome knew of the Slavs but never ruled them. During the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, Slavic-speaking communities occupied regions beyond the formal boundaries of the Roman Empire, yet they were not isolated from it. Instead, they existed within a series of frontier contact zones where trade, indirect political influence, and regional instability shaped their development without resulting in direct imperial incorporation. Roman knowledge of the peoples north and east of the Danube was limited and often imprecise. Classical authors such as Pliny the Elder, Tacitus, and Claudius Ptolemy recorded ethnographic descriptions of populations inhabiting Eastern Europe, but these accounts relied largely on second-hand information. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century CE, refers to the Veneti as a people living between Germanic and Sarmatian groups, noting their practices but expressing uncertainty about their ethnic classification. Modern scholarship remains divided on whether these Veneti can be directly identified with early Slavic populations, but their geographic placement overlaps with regions later associated with Slavic expansion. Ptolemy's Geographia, 2nd century CE, provides additional, though still ambiguous, references to tribes inhabiting the Vistula and Dnieper regions. These texts reflect Roman attempts to categorize frontier populations for strategic purposes rather than to document their internal identities. As a result, early Slavic groups appear in Roman literature only indirectly, filtered through imperial geographic and military concerns. Despite the absence of direct political control, archaeological evidence demonstrates sustained interaction between Slavic communities and the Roman world. Excavations across Central and Eastern Europe have uncovered Roman coins, metalwork, glassware, and ceramics within settlements associated with early Slavic material cultures, including the Zarabancy complex. These objects did not arrive through conquest but through trade networks that extended along river systems such as the Vistula, Bug, and Dniester. Trade diffusion exposed Slavic communities to Roman-manufactured goods and technological practices without fundamentally altering their social organization. Roman imports appear sporadically rather than systematically, suggesting exchange through intermediaries rather than direct commercial integration. These goods were often repurposed or redistributed locally, indicating selective adoption rather than dependency. There is no evidence that Roman economic models replaced indigenous subsistence systems during this period. The Roman frontier itself was not a static boundary. From the 2nd century onward, Pressures along the Danube limes intensified as Rome faced increasing challenges from Germanic confederations, internal political instability, and economic strain. These conditions affected populations beyond the frontier by disrupting existing trade routes and power balances. For Slavic communities, this instability created both risks and opportunities. As Roman authority weakened in peripheral regions, previously marginal areas experienced reduced military oversight. Archaeological layers from the 3rd and 4th centuries CE show shifts in settlement patterns north of the Danube, including population movement into zones formerly under indirect Roman influence. These changes were not the result of organized invasion but of gradual demographic realignment driven by frontier collapse. Roman military campaigns also contributed indirectly to Slavic development. Large-scale conflicts displaced neighboring populations, altering regional demographics. As Germanic groups migrated or were drawn into Roman service, ecological and settlement vacuums emerged in parts of Eastern Europe. Slavic communities, with their flexible agricultural systems and decentralized organization, were well positioned to occupy these spaces. Importantly, there is no evidence that early Slavic populations were ever formally incorporated into Roman administrative structures during this period. Unlike some Germanic elites, Slavic leaders did not enter Roman client relationships or adopt Roman titles. This absence of integration preserved local autonomy but also delayed the appearance of Slavs as named political actors in historical records. Roman influence nonetheless shaped Slavic societies in subtle ways. Exposure to imperial goods, coinage, and military practices contributed to gradual technological adaptation. However, these influences did not produce immediate social stratification or centralized authority. Slavic communities continued to operate primarily through kin-based organization and local decision-making, maintaining cultural continuity despite external contact. By the late 4th century CE, the Roman world was undergoing profound transformation. Imperial authority along the Danube frontier weakened significantly, and the political landscape of Eastern Europe entered a period of rapid change. Slavic populations, long accustomed to operating on the margins of empire, now faced a frontier in flux. As Roman power receded, new forces emerged along the borderlands, reshaping the conditions under which Slavic expansion would soon occur. Between empires and nomads, the Slavs adapted without assimilation. During the first few centuries of the Common Era, Slavic communities occupied a frontier space defined by the movements of neighboring peoples, particularly the Germanic Goths and the Iranian-speaking Sarmatians. These groups acted as intermediaries between the Roman world and the forest steppe regions, creating both challenges and opportunities for Slavic populations and shaping patterns of settlement, trade, and technological adoption. The Goths began migrating from Scandinavia and the Baltic regions into the Black Sea and Danube areas during the 3rd century CE. Archaeological evidence from the Wheelbark and Cherniakov cultures documents their movement, settlement patterns, and material culture, including weapon types, ceramics, and metalwork. Slavic groups in adjacent territories interacted with these Gothic communities indirectly through trade, conflict, and observation. Artifacts such as Gothic fibulae and horse trappings have been found in areas associated with early Slavic settlements, indicating limited adoption of foreign technologies and styles. At the same time, Sarmatian populations occupied the steppe regions north of the Black Sea. Known for their cavalry, iron weaponry, and long-range mobility, the Sarmatians influenced settlement organization and military techniques among their northern neighbors. Archaeological excavations show that Sarmatian metalworking practices, particularly in horse harnesses, swords, and decorative items, were occasionally incorporated into Slavic material culture. These incorporations reflect selective adaptation rather than cultural assimilation, preserving core Slavic settlement and subsistence structures. The positioning between Gothic and Sarmatian groups created a dynamic frontier environment. Slavic communities could observe innovations in metallurgy, equestrian equipment, and agricultural tools while maintaining autonomy over their own domestic and social systems. Excavations in the Middle Dnieper and Vistula regions indicate continuity in village layout, semi-subterranean dwellings, and utilitarian pottery, suggesting that external influence altered certain technological aspects without restructuring social organization. Trade and mobility were central to this process. Rivers and forested corridors allowed Slavic populations to access both Gothic and Sarmatian goods. Roman imports reaching the Goths were sometimes transferred further north and east, creating multi-stage networks of material exchange. Archaeological finds of Roman and Gothic-style objects in Slavic settlements demonstrate the integration of these networks into local economic systems without creating dependency or formal political incorporation. Military displacement in these frontier zones further influenced Slavic settlement patterns. Gothic migration southward toward the Danube and Black Sea caused displacement of earlier populations, opening marginal territories that Slavic communities could occupy. Similarly, Sarmatian pastoral practices and periodic movements created ecological pressure, encouraging Slavic settlements to adopt flexible subsistence strategies. Slash-and-burn agriculture, seasonal mobility, and dispersed village organization allowed early Slavs to respond to these pressures efficiently. The selective adoption of technologies and practices also extended to fortification and defense. While Gothic settlements included fortified towns and hilltop strongholds, early Slavic villages retained relatively simple structures. Archaeological evidence shows occasional reinforcement of dwellings with timber palisades, likely influenced by neighboring groups, but there is no indication of large-scale fortification prior to later centuries. This pattern reflects a strategy of partial adaptation, integrating useful innovations while maintaining social and spatial norms. These interactions reinforced the cultural autonomy of Slavic communities. Language, kinship, and ritual practices remained consistent across regions, even as material culture showed external influence. This continuity allowed Slavic populations to expand later with minimal disruption to social cohesion. It also positioned them to take advantage of opportunities arising from broader instability in Eastern Europe, particularly during the decline of Roman authority and the movement of steppe nomads. By the 4th century CE, the frontier environment had produced a Slavic population that was both resilient and adaptive. Exposure to Gothic and Sarmatian intermediaries facilitated selective technological and economic integration while preserving internal social structures. Rivers, forests, and dispersed settlements supported flexible mobility, allowing communities to occupy vacated or contested areas effectively. These adaptations became crucial as Eurasia entered a period of upheaval, setting the stage for the demographic expansions that would define early medieval Slavic history. The Huns did not conquer the Slavs, but they changed their world. During the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the westward movement of the Huns across the Eurasian steppe disrupted established populations and political networks in Eastern Europe, producing both pressure and opportunity for Slavic communities. While Slavic groups were not incorporated into the Hunnic Confederation as subjects in any systematic way, the invasions indirectly shaped settlement patterns, regional demographics, and avenues for expansion. By the late 4th century, the Huns had displaced a series of steppe populations, including Alans, Sarmatians, and Goths, forcing these groups to migrate toward the Danube and into Roman territories. Byzantine chroniclers such as Priscus of Panium described the mobility of Hunnic forces and the cascading effects on neighboring peoples. This displacement created significant demographic vacuums north of the Danube and along the Middle Dnieper, areas that would soon be accessible to Slavic communities. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that Slavic settlement patterns shifted in response to these changes. Sites in the Pripyat and Middle Dnieper basins from the late 4th to early 5th centuries show increased density and expansion into previously unoccupied or lightly populated zones. Semi-subterranean dwellings persisted, but the number and distribution of villages expanded, reflecting the colonization of newly available territory. Material culture remains consistent, indicating that these expansions were undertaken by indigenous populations rather than through replacement by external groups. The Hunnic shockwave also altered the balance of power in regions adjacent to the Roman frontier. Gothic and other Germanic polities, previously dominant in northern and central Danube zones, were weakened by military engagement with the Huns or displaced southward. Slavic communities, situated in the forest steppe margins, were positioned to exploit these instabilities. Unlike the Huns or Goths, they relied on flexible social structures, kin-based networks, and adaptable subsistence strategies, which allowed for rapid occupation of vacated lands without requiring centralized military coordination. Material exchanges during this period reflect indirect interaction with Hunnic movements. While few Hunnic artifacts appear in early Slavic settlements, the broader circulation of iron weaponry, horse harness components, and metalwork from Hunnic-occupied zones influenced local technological choices. Slavic communities adopted certain elements of mobility and craft without integrating fully into Hunnic military or political systems. This selective adoption preserved social and cultural continuity while enhancing resilience in a rapidly changing frontier environment. The impact of Hunnic pressure extended to population dispersal and long-term settlement strategy. Slavic groups began to occupy river corridors and floodplains that were previously under Germanic control, including regions along the Middle Dnieper, Upper Vistula, and Carpathian forelands. Archaeological surveys show increased village proliferation, suggesting that demographic growth was facilitated by access to new arable land. These movements did not involve conquest in the traditional sense. Instead, they reflect opportunistic expansion into depopulated areas, supported by communal labor and resource-sharing practices established in earlier centuries. Contemporary textual sources reinforce this pattern. Jordanes, writing in the mid-6th century, notes Slavic presence in territories previously inhabited by Gothic groups, emphasizing their mobility and ability to occupy lands vacated by other populations. Byzantine observers similarly remark on the growing numbers and territorial range of Slavic groups along the Danube frontier. These records, when correlated with archaeological evidence, suggest a period of accelerated Slavic dispersal directly linked to the cascading effects of Hunnic incursions. Despite the transformative impact of Hunnic movements, early Slavic communities maintained a high degree of autonomy. Social structures remained egalitarian and kin-based, with settlements continuing to rely on mixed agriculture, pastoralism, and forest exploitation. Village organization persisted in small clusters with semi-subterranean dwellings, and burial practices retained modest forms, consistent with earlier patterns. This stability amid regional upheaval highlights the adaptability of early Slavic society. By the end of the 5th century CE, the Hunnic shockwave had reshaped the demographic and political landscape of Eastern Europe. Slavic populations had expanded into previously marginal or depopulated territories, increasing their geographic range and setting the stage for the large-scale movements that would define the early medieval period. This disruption opened pathways for unprecedented migration, establishing the conditions under which Slavic communities could consolidate, differentiate, and later enter the historical record as a significant and widely distributed cultural group. Without armies or emperors, the Slavs spread across a continent. From the late 5th century through the 7th century CE, communities originating in the forest steppe zone of Eastern Europe expanded rapidly into Central, Southeastern, and Eastern Europe. This demographic movement was not driven by centralized political authority or organized military campaigns, but by population growth, agricultural efficiency, and flexible settlement strategies that allowed dispersed groups to occupy vast regions efficiently. Archaeological evidence indicates a marked increase in the number and density of Slavic settlements during this period. Excavations from the Middle Dnieper, Upper Vistula, and Carpathian forelands show clusters of semi-subterranean dwellings expanding into previously sparsely inhabited zones. Hydronymic studies tracing rivers, streams, and place names corroborate these patterns, revealing a proliferation of Slavic language toponyms in areas extending from the Elbe to the Dniester and from the Carpathians to the northern Balkans. This linguistic imprint reflects long-term occupation and the establishment of new communities by groups migrating from their ancestral homelands. Population growth during this period was facilitated by improvements in subsistence strategies. Early Slavic agriculture relied on slash-and-burn techniques, mixed cereal cultivation, and the maintenance of domesticated animals, including cattle, pigs, and sheep. These systems were labor-intensive but highly adaptable, enabling communities to clear new land for cultivation quickly. Increased productivity supported rising population density, creating pressure for expansion into available territories. Archaeobotanical studies suggest continuity in crop types, with minor innovations in field rotation and irrigation practices enhancing yield. Mobility was a critical component of expansion. Slavic communities typically organized settlements along rivers, floodplains, and forest margins, allowing access to fertile soils, freshwater, and transport corridors. Seasonal mobility, inherited from earlier subsistence strategies, facilitated both exploration of new lands and the relocation of entire communities when ecological or demographic pressures demanded. Villages were small and dispersed, often numbering a few dozen households, which allowed for rapid establishment without extensive infrastructure. The nature of Slavic expansion contrasts with that of contemporary political entities. Unlike Germanic or steppe confederations, Slavic movements were not characterized by conquest, elite imposition, or warfare-driven assimilation. Archaeological layers rarely indicate destruction or replacement of existing populations. Rather, settlements appear in marginal or lightly inhabited zones, suggesting opportunistic colonization. Material culture remains consistent with earlier Proto-Slavic patterns, with modest pottery, semi-subterranean dwellings, and utilitarian tools dominating assemblages. This continuity demonstrates the selective adoption of external innovations without disruption to social structures. Hydronymic evidence provides additional insight into migration pathways. Rivers such as the Vistula, Dnieper, Dniester, and Danube tributaries bear Slavic-derived names, indicating the sequence and direction of settlement. Place name analysis suggests systematic occupation along navigable waterways, which offered transport for people, livestock, and agricultural produce. These corridors enabled long-distance movement without centralized coordination, reflecting decentralized networks of kin-based communities acting in parallel rather than under a single authority. The pace of expansion was accelerated by regional instability following the decline of Roman authority and Hunnic incursions. Vacated or depopulated zones in the Carpathian Basin, Pannonian Plain, and Northern Balkans created ecological and demographic opportunities for settlement. Slavic groups with flexible subsistence and social organization could exploit these opportunities more effectively than larger, less mobile populations. Archaeological surveys show village formation in areas formerly dominated by Germanic or Romanized communities, demonstrating a pattern of occupation rather than conquest. Contact with established imperial borders occurred progressively. By the late 6th century, Slavic groups were moving into regions adjacent to Byzantine provinces, including Moesia, Thrace, and Dalmatia. Their presence along these frontiers is documented in Byzantine chronicles, which note Slavic raids, settlements, and the gradual encroachment of population. These interactions reveal that the Slavic expansion was both demographic and spatial, bringing communities into proximity with organized political entities while maintaining social autonomy. Material culture during this expansion continued to emphasize subsistence and practicality. Pottery remains predominantly hand-built and undecorated, with household tools and storage pits reflecting local adaptation rather than elite patronage. Evidence of small-scale metalworking, particularly iron knives, axes, and agricultural implements, demonstrates self-sufficiency. There is little indication of centralized production or hierarchical organization, reinforcing the view that expansion was population-driven rather than elite-directed. By the 7th century, the demographic momentum established a widespread Slavic presence across much of Eastern and Central Europe. Settlement patterns demonstrate continuity from ancestral homelands, with extended kin groups forming the basic unit of social organization. This foundation facilitated subsequent differentiation into distinct regional subgroups, laying the groundwork for political structures that would emerge in later centuries. Expansion brought the Slavs into direct contact with imperial borders, creating new dynamics that would shape interactions with Byzantium, the Avars, and emerging early medieval polities. The Balkans became the Slavs' gateway into recorded history. By the late 6th century CE, expanding Slavic populations had begun to move beyond their forest steppe homelands, interacting directly with the Byzantine Empire along the Danube frontier. Archaeological evidence and contemporary chronicles illustrate a complex pattern of raiding, settlement, and gradual integration, highlighting the Slavs' transformation from peripheral communities into recognized actors within the imperial periphery. Primary written sources provide critical insights into these interactions. Procopius of Caesarea, writing in the mid-6th century, reports on Slavic incursions along the Danube, describing seasonal raids into Byzantine provinces such as Moesia and Thrace. Slavic groups, often in alliance with Avar or other nomadic confederations, targeted agricultural villages and riverine settlements. These raids were primarily opportunistic, exploiting weakened imperial defenses and regional instability, rather than constituting a coordinated campaign of conquest. Byzantine military manuals, including those attributed to Emperor Maurice, further document the strategies employed to counter Slavic movements. The empire relied on mobile frontier forces and fortified positions along the Danube limes, but the dispersed and flexible nature of Slavic incursions complicated defensive efforts. Archaeological evidence, including temporary camp structures and river crossings, confirms that Slavic groups could navigate both forested and floodplain environments with agility, enabling repeated penetration of Byzantine territories without establishing initial permanent control. Settlement evidence from this period illustrates a gradual transition from raiding to colonization. Early Slavic presence in the Balkan interior is initially sparse and ephemeral, often concentrated near river valleys and wetlands. Over time, however, Slavic villages appear in archaeological layers formerly associated with abandoned Roman or Germanic sites. Semi-subterranean dwellings, hand-built pottery, and iron tools remain consistent with prior Slavic material culture, suggesting that migration involved communities retaining their social and technological norms rather than adopting Byzantine urban models. The process of settlement was facilitated by the ecological compatibility of the Danube frontier with prior Slavic homelands. Fertile floodplains, forested margins, and navigable rivers allowed familiar subsistence strategies, slash-and-burn agriculture, mixed cereal cultivation, and animal husbandry to continue effectively. Archaeobotanical analysis shows continuity in crop types, while zooarchaeological remains indicate maintenance of cattle, pigs, and sheep. This continuity supported demographic growth, which in turn reinforced permanent village establishment. Chronicles indicate that Slavic settlement was often negotiated or tolerated rather than forcibly imposed. Byzantine records describe periods of tribute, local alliance, and integration of Slavic communities into frontier administration. Although direct political incorporation was limited, imperial authorities increasingly recognized Slavic groups as a factor in regional governance, granting de facto acknowledgement of their presence. Such arrangements allowed Slavs to occupy new territories while maintaining communal autonomy and kin-based organization. Material culture suggests selective adoption of Byzantine technologies and practices. Metalwork, ceramics, and occasionally coinage appear in Slavic sites, but architectural forms and domestic organization remain consistent with northern patterns. The adoption was practical, focused on utility rather than social emulation, allowing Slavs to integrate economically without compromising internal cohesion. Fortified settlements remained rare, reflecting both demographic flexibility and the continued emphasis on dispersed village life. Raiding and settlement often overlapped. Slavic groups exploited Byzantine weaknesses to access resources while simultaneously establishing footholds in newly available territory. Seasonal mobility persisted, but riverine transport and environmental knowledge allowed communities to expand their range and sustain larger populations. The combined effect of opportunistic raiding and gradual colonization transformed peripheral groups into a stable regional presence, capable of negotiating the frontier environment on their own terms. By the late 7th century, these processes produced durable Slavic communities throughout much of the Balkans. The Danube frontier evolved from a zone of sporadic conflict into a space of interaction, trade, and permanent occupation. Slavic populations became significant actors in regional dynamics, contributing to both demographic and political transformation of Byzantine borderlands. This period marks the first consistent textual and archaeological record of Slavs as a recognizable and territorially rooted population. Permanent settlement along the Danube fundamentally altered Slavic society. Villages expanded, kin networks stabilized, and local governance mechanisms matured. Communities previously engaged primarily in seasonal mobility or opportunistic raids were now embedded in specific landscapes, capable of sustained agricultural production and demographic growth. These structural changes set the stage for subsequent political developments, including the formation of Slavic polities in the early medieval Balkans. By integrating into the Byzantine frontier system without full subordination, Slavs established a model of expansion that combined demographic strength with adaptive flexibility. Their presence along the Danube demonstrates the capacity of decentralized, kin-based societies to navigate complex imperial peripheries effectively. The Danube frontier thus represents a critical junction in Slavic history, the first recorded intersection of Slavic communities with major political entities, and the initial step toward regional consolidation and influence. 1 People, 3 paths. By the late 7th century CE, Slavic populations, initially linked through shared language and culture, began to differentiate geographically and politically. This divergence into Western, Eastern, and Southern Slavs reflected environmental variation, interactions with neighboring societies, and differing degrees of exposure to imperial systems. These regional distinctions would lay the foundation for the earliest medieval Slavic polities. The Western Slavs settled primarily in the upper and middle Vistula, Oder, and Elbe river basins, occupying regions corresponding to modern Poland, Czechia, and Slovakia. Archaeological evidence demonstrates a continuation of dispersed village settlement, supplemented by the development of larger fortified centers in some areas by the late 7th century. Interaction with Germanic groups, particularly remnants of the Lombards, Saxons, and Thuringians, influenced material culture and settlement patterns. Imported metalwork and weapon types appear in select sites, reflecting limited technological exchange without wholesale cultural assimilation. The Western environment, plains interspersed with river valleys, supported both small-scale agriculture and long-distance mobility, shaping economic and social differentiation from Eastern and Southern counterparts. In the Eastern Slavic zone, populations expanded along the Dnieper, Don, and Upper Volga river systems. The forest steppe environment required more extensive land clearance for agriculture, encouraging larger dispersed settlements and seasonal flexibility. Interaction with steppe nomads, including Pecheneg and remnants of Sarmatian populations, contributed to selective adoption of equestrian technologies and iron weaponry. Archaeological sites indicate continuity in semi-subterranean dwellings, but there is evidence of larger communal structures emerging in riverine corridors, suggesting early administrative coordination within kin-based networks. The Southern Slavs, moving into the Balkan interior, encountered the Byzantine Empire directly. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates the dual processes of raiding and colonization along the Danube, Morava, and Vardar valleys. Byzantine sources, including Procopius and later Constantine VII, describe the settlement of Slavic groups within former Roman lands. Material culture in this region reflects both indigenous Slavic traditions and selective integration of Byzantine techniques, particularly in metallurgy, ceramics, and limited fortification. The varied Balkan terrain, mountains, river valleys, and wetlands encouraged localized adaptations and contributed to regional differentiation. Language remained a central unifying factor even as divergence progressed. The Proto-Slavic lexicon began to fragment along regional lines, producing early dialectical variation that would later solidify into distinct linguistic branches: West Slavic, East Slavic, and South Slavic. Hydronymic studies illustrate this pattern clearly. Rivers, streams, and settlements retain region-specific Slavic names, showing continuity of linguistic identity, even amid environmental and political variation. Geography and natural barriers accelerated differentiation. The Carpathian Mountains and Danube corridor separated Western and Southern Slavs, while the vast forest steppe zones east of the Dnieper encouraged isolation and slower integration into southern and western networks. These environmental constraints influenced settlement density, subsistence strategies, and interactions with neighboring peoples, reinforcing regional distinctions. Archaeologically, pottery, tools, and settlement layouts vary subtly between zones, reflecting adaptation to local conditions rather than abrupt cultural rupture. Political contact also shaped divergence. Western Slavs increasingly interacted with Frankish and Germanic polities, adopting select administrative practices and participating in trade networks without losing communal autonomy. Eastern Slavs remained relatively insulated, negotiating with steppe nomads but lacking integration into centralized empires. Southern Slavs, in contrast, were incorporated into Byzantine tribute systems and occasionally recruited into imperial military operations. These varying levels of imperial engagement contributed to differentiated trajectories in social organization and political development. By the end of the 7th century, the three Slavic branches had established distinct demographic and cultural footprints. Western Slavs consolidated along the Central European plains, Eastern Slavs along the extensive riverine networks of Eastern Europe, and Southern Slavs in the Balkans and adjacent river valleys. Settlement archaeology indicates that while material culture remained broadly consistent, local adaptations in housing, fortification, and subsistence practices reflected the pressures and opportunities specific to each zone. The divergence of Slavic populations was not absolute. Shared linguistic roots, kin-based organization, and subsistence continuity maintained cohesion across broad distances. However, regional differentiation allowed communities to respond more effectively to their immediate environments and neighboring powers. This process set the stage for the emergence of early medieval polities, including the later formation of Great Moravia, the early Rus and Balkan Slavic principalities, demonstrating how environmental, social, and political factors interacted to produce multiple historical trajectories from a single cultural linguistic origin. Divergence also facilitated the integration of Slavic groups into wider European networks. Western Slavs engaged with Central European trade routes and emerging Frankish political systems. Eastern Slavs were positioned for future engagement with steppe polities and riverine commerce, and Southern Slavs became embedded in Byzantine economic and military systems. This triadic differentiation ensured that the Slavs were prepared for both internal consolidation and external interaction, setting the foundation for political complexity in the early medieval period. By the close of the 7th century, the Slavic world had transitioned from a relatively homogeneous population in the forest steppe to a regionally differentiated network of communities occupying Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. The process of divergence illustrates the interplay of environment, neighbor relations, and variable political absorption, providing a framework for understanding the emergence of early states and the long-term trajectory of Slavic history. Slavic power rested in councils, not crowns. Early Slavic communities, particularly during the 7th and 8th centuries CE, operated under decentralized governance structures that prioritized consensus and local decision-making. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that authority was distributed across village assemblies, clan networks, and temporary war leaders, rather than concentrated in hereditary kings or centralized bureaucracies. The Vesh, a term recorded in later Slavic chronicles, provides the clearest conceptual model for early political organization. While direct references to assemblies in the 7th century are scarce, later sources suggest continuity with earlier traditions. A Vesh typically involved male heads of households and elders participating in decision-making processes concerning war, diplomacy, and communal obligations. Leadership was situational and elective rather than inherited, reflecting a social structure rooted in kinship and equality within the community. Temporary leadership emerged primarily in the context of military campaigns or crisis management. Archaeological evidence of fortified settlements, such as early hill forts in Central Europe, implies coordinated defensive action that would have required recognized leaders. Byzantine sources, including Theophylact Simocatta, describe Slavic war leaders who could mobilize multiple villages but retained limited authority outside the scope of conflict. This indicates a system in which authority was functional and constrained rather than institutionalized. Decentralization extended to economic and social governance. Land distribution, agricultural coordination, and resource management were managed communally or at the level of extended kin networks. Excavations of settlement clusters reveal relatively uniform housing, storage pits, and tools, with no evidence of elite residences or palatial structures, confirming that material inequality was minimal. This egalitarianism reinforced the functioning of assemblies and consensus-based decision-making. The tribal governance model also facilitated mobility and adaptability. Dispersed villages with autonomous decision-making could respond rapidly to environmental pressures, seasonal resource needs, or neighboring threats. Kin-based obligations ensured cooperation without hierarchical imposition, allowing communities to act collectively when necessary while maintaining local autonomy. Archaeological continuity in housing and settlement layouts across large regions supports the persistence of this decentralized framework over several centuries. External threats, however, increasingly pressured these governance structures. The expansion of Avar and later Frankish influence, as well as Byzantine military activity in the Balkans, created situations where situational war leaders had to coordinate larger coalitions. Assemblies adapted by granting temporary authority to capable individuals, demonstrating flexibility within the decentralized system. This process highlights a key dynamic in early Slavic political evolution. Authority was earned and functional rather than inherited. Ethnographic comparisons reinforce this interpretation. Similar patterns of assembly-based governance are observed in other early medieval tribal societies, where decentralized structures balance mobility, subsistence needs, and conflict management. Among the Slavs, the combination of linguistic cohesion, kinship networks, and flexible leadership allowed communities to maintain stability across large geographic areas without resorting to centralized state apparatus. Conflict mediation and law enforcement were likewise organized through collective mechanisms. Customary law, often transmitted orally, governed disputes related to property, marriage, and interclan relations. Archaeological studies of settlements with multiple households suggest coordination in the construction and use of communal infrastructure, such as granaries and defensive works, which would have required collective decision-making and oversight. The persistence of decentralized governance also influenced settlement patterns. Villages were spaced to optimize agricultural and environmental resources rather than to enforce political control, and the uniformity of domestic structures reflected the absence of pronounced social stratification. This spatial organization reinforced the authority of assemblies, as communities could maintain autonomy while coordinating regionally for defense and resource management. By the 8th century, the pressures of warfare, population growth, and territorial expansion prompted incremental changes. Assemblies increasingly endorsed long-term leadership in certain contexts, foreshadowing the later emergence of hereditary rulers in early Slavic states. Nevertheless, even as political complexity grew, the underlying principles of consensus, kinship-based decision-making, and situational authority remained central to governance, distinguishing Slavic political organization from the monarchies and centralized bureaucracies of neighboring societies. Slavic tribal governance demonstrates the capacity of decentralized societies to manage large populations, coordinate defense, and adapt to environmental and political pressures without resorting to hierarchical state structures. The Vesh and situational leadership mechanisms provided both stability and flexibility, allowing communities to survive and expand into contested regions. External threats highlighted the utility of these structures, setting the stage for the emergence of stronger leadership while preserving core principles of autonomy and collective decision-making. By the close of this period, Slavic governance had evolved into a system capable of negotiating both internal coordination and external challenges, providing the foundation upon which tribal confederations and proto-states would later form. The Avars ruled, but never fully controlled. From the late 6th to the early 9th centuries CE, the Avar Khaganate extended its influence across the Carpathian Basin and adjacent regions, incorporating large Slavic populations into its political and military networks. Archaeological, textual, and numismatic evidence illustrates the nature of this subordination. Slavs provided labor, tribute, and military service, yet maintained internal autonomy and cultural continuity. By the late 6th century, the Avars, a nomadic confederation of Eurasian origin, had established a centralized authority under the Khagan, consolidating control through fortified centers and mounted forces. Byzantine sources, including Theophylact Simocatta and later Constantine VII, describe campaigns against Slavic groups and the imposition of tribute obligations. Slavic villages within the Khaganate were often required to supply food, labor, and men for military campaigns, integrating these communities into a wider imperial economy without displacing local governance structures. Archaeological evidence supports a nuanced understanding of this relationship. Excavations in the Carpathian Basin reveal Slavic settlements that continued semi-subterranean house construction, small-scale agriculture, and kin-based organization, despite their inclusion in Avar-controlled territories. Burials from this period show minimal Avar cultural markers within Slavic cemeteries, suggesting that while tribute and military obligations were enforced, cultural assimilation was limited. Slavic identity and social cohesion remained resilient, even under nominal Avar domination. Military obligations were central to the Khaganate's leverage. Slavic levies were mobilized as infantry and logistical support, supplementing the Avar-mounted contingents during campaigns against Byzantine and neighboring peoples. Byzantine chronicles describe Slavic participation in raids along the Danube frontier, often acting under Avar direction. Despite this militarization, command structures remained largely external. Local Slavic leaders oversaw the organization of villages and labor, but ultimate strategic decisions rested with the Khaganate. Tribute obligations reinforced Avar control but also demonstrated its limits. Slavic communities were responsible for supplying agricultural produce, livestock, and manufactured goods. Yet enforcement was uneven and often negotiated locally. Archaeological surveys show that some Slavic settlements flourished economically during this period, implying that Avar extraction did not fully disrupt subsistence or population growth. The persistence of kin-based governance and village autonomy indicates that integration into the Khaganate was practical rather than comprehensive. Resistance to Avar authority, both passive and active, shaped the development of early Slavic political consciousness. Byzantine sources record localized revolts and refusals to provide tribute, suggesting that Slavic groups could coordinate action despite decentralized governance. Archaeological evidence of abandoned or burned settlements corresponds with documented uprisings, confirming periods of friction between subordinate Slavs and the Khaganate. These incidents highlight the tension inherent in a system of partial subordination. The Avars could impose obligations but lacked mechanisms for total administrative control. Cultural and economic adaptation further illustrates the complexity of Slavic-Avar interaction. While military technology, such as iron weaponry and horse harness components, diffused into Slavic communities, domestic life and subsistence practices remained consistent with earlier traditions. Hand-built pottery, semi-subterranean dwellings, and communal agricultural patterns persisted across Avar-controlled regions, underscoring the selective nature of cultural influence. Slavs retained material autonomy even while participating in the Khaganate's broader economic and military networks. The decentralized Slavic structure contributed to the Khaganate's inability to fully assimilate these populations. Leadership rested on kin-based councils and situational war chiefs, which allowed local organization to continue independently. The Avars could command tribute and mobilize manpower, but village assemblies maintained oversight of internal affairs. This organizational resilience ensured cultural continuity and limited the Khaganate's administrative penetration, creating conditions for eventual autonomy. By the late 8th century, internal pressures on the Khaganate, combined with external conflicts with the Frankish Empire and Byzantium, weakened centralized Avar authority. Slavic populations increasingly asserted autonomy, consolidating settlements and forming larger political networks capable of self-defense and negotiation. Byzantine accounts of the period document Slavic involvement in military campaigns independent of Avar command, marking a shift from subordinate communities to proto-political entities. This gradual assertion of independence fostered proto-state consciousness among Slavic groups. Communities that had experienced centralized demands for tribute and military service began to coordinate across larger territories, establishing networks that could maintain stability without external oversight. Archaeological evidence of expanding fortified settlements and intensified trade networks indicates emerging regional coordination, laying the groundwork for the early Slavic polities that would appear in the 9th century. By the early 9th century, the Avar Khaganate had diminished as a dominant power in Central Europe. Slavic communities formerly under its suzerainty had consolidated politically, forming the structural basis for polities such as Great Moravia and other emerging principalities. This transition illustrates the dual role of subordination. While Avar demands imposed constraints, they also indirectly encouraged political cohesion, strategic coordination, and leadership capacity among Slavs. In sum, the Slavic experience under the Avars demonstrates a model of limited integration and strategic resilience. Military and tribute obligations imposed by the Khaganate did not extinguish local autonomy. Instead, they reinforced the importance of kin-based governance and adaptive settlement strategies. Resistance and negotiation fostered the emergence of proto-state structures, transforming subordinate communities into politically capable actors. This period illustrates how exposure to external domination can stimulate internal consolidation, setting the stage for the formation of early medieval Slavic polities. For the first time, Slavs ruled themselves. In the early 7th century CE, a Frankish merchant named Samo, established a realm that united diverse Slavic tribes along the upper and middle Danube. This polity, often referred to as Samo's Confederation, represents the earliest recorded instance of Slavic political organization transcending local tribal assemblies. Though temporary and limited in territorial scope, it demonstrates the capacity for decentralized communities to coordinate under a recognized leadership in response to external pressures. Samo's rise is documented primarily in the Frankish Chronicle of Fredegar, which describes his leadership during conflicts with the Avars around 623 CE. According to the chronicle, Samo was elected by local Slavic communities after demonstrating military capability and strategic acumen. This illustrates a continuation of situational leadership models. Authority was earned and functional rather than hereditary, reflecting pre-existing patterns of tribal governance while adapting to the demands of a larger confederation. The confederation's composition included multiple Slavic groups across the Morava, Sava, and Upper Danube basins, encompassing regions of modern-day Czechia, Slovakia, Austria, and Slovenia. Archaeological evidence indicates that settlements in these areas remained semi-subterranean, dispersed, and kin-based, consistent with earlier social structures. Yet the scale of coordination, particularly in organizing defenses and military expeditions, suggests a higher degree of political integration than had previously been possible. Samo's ability to unify disparate communities underscores the flexibility of Slavic governance in forming temporary superlocal structures without imposing permanent hierarchy. Military organization was central to the confederation's cohesion. The Fredegar Chronicle recounts several victories against the Avars, emphasizing Samo's capacity to coordinate multi-tribal forces. Archaeological findings of fortifications along key river routes, such as the Morava Valley, support the presence of coordinated defensive strategies. Slavic groups contributed manpower while retaining local autonomy, demonstrating that collective action could coexist with decentralized governance. This arrangement reflects the broader pattern of coalition-building characteristic of early Slavic polities. Economic integration within the confederation appears pragmatic rather than institutionalized. Settlements continued to rely on slash-and-burn agriculture, pastoralism, and local trade networks. Evidence of regional exchange, such as iron tools, pottery, and occasionally imported goods from neighboring Germanic territories, suggests a degree of coordination in resource management, likely facilitated by the Confederation's leadership. Yet there is no indication of centralized taxation or formal bureaucracy, reinforcing the view that Samo's authority functioned primarily in military and diplomatic spheres. The Confederation also illustrates the interaction between Slavic communities and external powers. The Avar Khaganate, previously dominant in the region, was challenged by Samo's coalition, reflecting a shift in regional power dynamics. Frankish sources note that Samo maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring powers, including Dagobert I of the Frankish kingdom, further emphasizing the Confederation's capacity for external negotiation. Slavs were no longer merely tributary subjects. They could organize collectively to defend territory, assert autonomy, and engage in interregional diplomacy. Cultural and social continuity persisted within Samo's realm. Villages retained traditional organization, kin-based governance, and customary law. Archaeological surveys reveal that while military coordination increased, domestic structures and subsistence strategies remained consistent. This continuity highlights the adaptive nature of Slavic political culture. It could expand organizational capacity without undermining established social norms. The Confederation was inherently temporary. Fredegar notes that Samo's death around 658 CE led to the fragmentation of his realm, as local assemblies reasserted authority and superlocal coordination dissipated. Archaeological evidence confirms a return to dispersed village networks in certain regions, illustrating the limitations of early centralized leadership within the context of decentralized, kin-based societies. Nevertheless, Samo's confederation established a precedent for supertribal organization, demonstrating the potential for coordinated political and military action. Samo's realm also served as a catalyst for subsequent Slavic polities. The experience of unified action, temporary superlocal leadership, and coordinated defense against external threats provided a political template for later developments. including the formation of Great Moravia, the early Bulgarian state, and other regional confederations. The confederation shows that political sophistication could emerge without permanent monarchy or centralized bureaucracy, relying instead on functional leadership, collective decision-making, and adaptive coalition building. By the mid-7th century, the Slavic world had evolved from a network of largely autonomous villages to interconnected communities capable of superlocal coordination. Samos Confederation represents a critical milestone in this evolution. It illustrates the intersection of kin-based governance, military necessity, and strategic leadership. While ephemeral, it confirmed that Slavic societies could organize on a larger scale, laying the foundation for more permanent state structures in the subsequent centuries. The legacy of Samos Confederation highlights the capacity of early Slavs to adapt their political institutions in response to external pressures while maintaining internal social cohesion. This balance between continuity and innovation set the stage for the accelerated process of state formation and regional consolidation that would characterize the 8th and 9th centuries, ensuring the Slavs' transition from tribal communities into recognized political actors in early medieval Europe. The Slavic gods ruled forests, storms, and fate. Prior to Christianization, Slavic communities maintained a complex pagan cosmology, centered on a pantheon of deities governing natural forces, fertility, and societal order. While written records are largely post-Christian, early medieval chronicles, combined with archaeological findings, provide a framework for understanding these beliefs and their integration into daily life. Primary sources such as Thietmar of Merseburg, later Byzantine writings, and occasional references in Nestor's primary chronicle describe deities like Purin, the god of thunder and war, Veles, associated with livestock, wealth, and the underworld, and Mokosh, linked to fertility and female labor. Archaeologists corroborate these accounts with evidence from ritual sites, figurines, and sanctified groves, suggesting that the Slavs actively organized their spiritual practice around both natural landmarks and constructed altars. Purin, as the principal deity in many northern and central Slavic communities, symbolized the protective and martial aspects of society. Accounts from later chroniclers describe the use of wooden idols, sometimes placed on hilltops or near rivers, where offerings of animals, grain, and tools were made. Archaeological findings, including ornamented axes and ritual deposits, support this association with martial and agricultural spheres. Purin's prominence reflects a societal emphasis on collective defense, authority, and the regulation of conflict within and between communities. Veles functioned as a complementary force, overseeing wealth, cattle, and subterranean realms. Slavic cosmology often framed these deities in opposition or balance, with Veles representing hidden forces, seasonal cycles, and wealth accumulation. Evidence from sacrificial pits containing animal bones, jewelry, and metal artifacts suggests that rituals addressed both tangible material prosperity and intangible societal well-being. Veles veneration demonstrates the interplay of economic stability, ritual practice, and community cohesion. Mokosh illustrates the integration of domestic and agrarian life into spiritual practice. Represented in some findings by female figurines or carved posts, she oversaw fertility, textile production, and the labor of women within villages. Archaeobotanical analysis of ritual deposits, including grains, flax, and wool fragments, supports her connection to agricultural cycles and domestic productivity. Mokosh's role underscores the embedding of spiritual observance into the rhythm of village life, linking everyday labor to cosmic order. Ritual landscapes were central to this cosmology. Sacred groves, springs, and riverbanks served as focal points for collective ceremonies. Archaeologists have identified sites where ceramic offerings, wooden idols, and burnt animal bones co-occur, suggesting sustained cultic activity over multiple generations. Unlike monumental temples of neighboring societies, these spaces were decentralized and accessible, reflecting the egalitarian and community-oriented nature of Slavic belief. Calendrical observances reinforced societal cohesion. Seasonal festivals, often linked to solstices, harvest cycles, and agricultural milestones, combined ritual sacrifice, communal feasting, and performance. Chroniclers note that such festivals functioned to align communal activity with natural cycles, regulate labor, and reinforce social hierarchies through shared religious obligation. The repetition of these practices strengthened cultural identity, providing a common framework for dispersed communities. The Slavic pantheon was inherently adaptable, integrating local deities and spirits with overarching figures like Purin and Velis. Archaeological evidence of regional variation, such as differing figurine styles, localized shrine construction, and river-specific ritual deposits, indicates that cosmology was not rigidly codified but responsive to environmental and social contexts. This flexibility allowed spiritual practice to persist despite migrations, conflicts, and exposure to neighboring empires. Belief also functioned as a mechanism of social cohesion. Rituals, festivals, and sacred sites structured communal life, providing shared norms and reinforcing kinship networks. Leaders, whether temporary war chiefs or village assemblies, often mediated religious observances, linking authority to spiritual legitimacy. This integration of governance and ritual maintained stability in decentralized societies, allowing widespread populations to coordinate activity, celebrate shared identity, and navigate social and ecological challenges. By the late 1st millennium CE, Slavic pagan cosmology had evolved into a complex, community-oriented system deeply embedded in daily life. Deities governed natural phenomena, economic productivity, and social order, while ritual observance connected dispersed communities across vast territories. Archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrates that this belief system was resilient, adaptable, and central to Slavic identity, reinforcing cohesion long before political centralization or Christianization transformed the landscape. The continuity of Slavic pagan practice illustrates the interaction of culture, environment, and social organization. By mediating relationships with natural forces, economic resources, and communal networks, cosmology helped maintain internal stability, regulate behavior, and guide interactions with neighboring peoples. This spiritual foundation would persist subtly even after the advent of Christianity, informing folklore, cultural norms, and regional identity throughout the medieval period. Belief in deities like Purin, Velis, and Mokosh provided both a shared framework for interpreting the world and practical guidance for social organization, linking ecological cycles, economic activity, and kinship networks. The Slavic pantheon's decentralized, adaptive, and integrative structure set the stage for cultural continuity, ensuring that dispersed tribal communities could operate cohesively while responding to the challenges of migration, conflict, and interaction with imperial powers. By reinforcing social cohesion and guiding collective action, Slavic cosmology established a durable framework for cultural identity, bridging the gap between decentralized tribal governance and the eventual development of early medieval polities. Memory survived without writing. Slavic communities prior to Christianization relied on ritual, burial practices, and oral tradition to transmit cultural knowledge, regulate social behavior, and commemorate the deceased. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates that these practices maintained cohesion across dispersed settlements, providing continuity even in the absence of formal record-keeping. Cremation was the predominant funerary practice among early Slavs, particularly from the 6th through 8th centuries CE. Excavations reveal pyre sites accompanied by grave goods, including pottery, tools, and occasionally ornaments, suggesting beliefs in an afterlife and social differentiation. The distribution and placement of burials indicate organized communal oversight, with cemeteries often located near settlements but set apart to mark sacred space. Unlike monumental tombs of neighboring elites, Slavic cremation practices emphasized collective norms over individual prestige, reinforcing egalitarian social structures. Material evidence illustrates ritual variation across regions. In some sites, ashes were placed in urns with symbolic motifs, while in others, remains were deposited in pits without containers. Animal remains and food offerings accompany select burials, reflecting ritualized attempts to secure sustenance for the deceased in the afterlife. Archaeologists interpret these practices as both spiritual observance and mechanisms for maintaining social memory, connecting living communities to ancestral continuity. Oral tradition was equally central to Slavic cultural transmission. Songs, legends, and mnemonic devices preserved communal history, genealogies, and mythological narratives. Sources such as later chronicles and folklore collections provide indirect evidence for this practice, indicating that early Slavs relied on memorized narratives to codify law, morality, and historical events. These oral networks allowed knowledge to circulate across villages, ensuring cohesion among populations that were geographically dispersed and politically decentralized. Seasonal rituals structured both agricultural and social life. Celebrations linked to solstices, equinoxes, and harvest cycles incorporated offerings, feasting, and performance, reinforcing community bonds and synchronizing activity with ecological rhythms. Archaeological finds of burnt plant remains, ceramic vessels, and ritual deposits at specific times of year correspond with these seasonal observances, suggesting a systematic approach to coordinating labor, fertility, and social interaction. Ritual practices also functioned as mechanisms for boundary negotiation and conflict resolution. Communal ceremonies reinforced kinship obligations and established shared norms, mitigating potential disputes in societies without centralized courts. By embedding social regulation within religious observance, communities maintained stability while reinforcing collective identity. Archaeological patterns, such as the consistent placement of ritual deposits near village centers or water sources, underscore the spatial integration of ritual and daily life. Folklore and myth complemented material ritual, providing interpretive frameworks for natural events, moral instruction, and societal norms. Stories of deities, spirits, and ancestral heroes transmitted ethical and practical guidance, sustaining cohesion even across migrations or population dispersals. The interplay of oral narrative and ritual practice created a resilient cultural matrix, enabling Slavs to preserve identity without reliance on written record. Cremation, seasonal festivals, and oral storytelling also facilitated adaptation to new environments. As Slavic populations migrated into Central and Southeastern Europe during the 6th and 7th centuries, these flexible practices could be integrated into local contexts without significant structural disruption. Archaeological continuity, consistent dwelling types, ritual deposits, and ceremonial layouts demonstrates that cultural norms were maintained even as communities encountered new ecological and political landscapes. The cumulative effect of these practices was the preservation of cultural memory and social cohesion. By linking material ritual with oral narrative, Slavs could codify identity, transmit knowledge, and reinforce communal obligations across multiple generations. These mechanisms underpinned social continuity, enabling tribal networks to expand, coordinate, and interact with neighboring polities while retaining a distinct cultural framework. By the late 8th century, ritual, burial, and oral tradition had laid the groundwork for cultural resilience in the face of external influence. The integration of local ecological knowledge, seasonal cycles, and mythological narratives created a framework that was both stable and adaptable, allowing communities to navigate political, environmental, and demographic changes. This flexibility would prove essential during Christianization, facilitating a transition in religious practice while preserving foundational aspects of Slavic identity. Cultural memory, transmitted without writing, ensured that knowledge of ancestors, moral norms, and cosmological understanding remained active in everyday life. These practices enabled dispersed Slavic communities to maintain cohesion, negotiate social obligations, and adapt ritual observance to new territories, setting the stage for both continued cultural integrity and eventual political consolidation. Through cremation rites, seasonal festivals, and oral tradition, Slavs sustained a robust cultural system that bridged generations, preserved identity, and reinforced social networks, demonstrating that memory and cohesion do not depend on written records but on structured communal practice and adaptive cultural mechanisms. Christianity arrived long before conversion. Long before Slavic polities formally adopted the faith, Slavic communities along the Danube, Morava, and Balkan frontiers had repeated exposure to Christian ideas, practices, and institutions. Contact occurred primarily through Byzantine missionaries, diplomatic relations, trade networks, and neighboring Christian populations, shaping cultural and political expectations even prior to systematic conversion. Byzantine chronicles document sustained interaction with Slavic communities during the 6th through 8th centuries CE. Military campaigns, tribute arrangements, and trade along the Danube brought Slavs into contact with Christian clergy and ritual objects. Procopius of Caesarea and later writers note the presence of Christian priests accompanying Byzantine envoys, facilitating limited religious instruction, and occasionally mediating between communities and imperial authorities. This contact introduced basic liturgical knowledge, iconography, and ritual norms into Slavic awareness, without imposing systematic ecclesiastical control. Missionary activity intensified in the 7th century, particularly under Constantine IV and later emperors, who sought to extend Byzantine influence through religious and diplomatic means. Sources indicate that itinerant clergy operated in border regions, establishing small churches, teaching liturgical practice, and promoting baptism among local elites or influential families. Archaeological evidence, including early Christian crosses, small chapels, and imported religious artifacts, confirms these interactions in the northern Balkans and lower Danube. While isolated, such sites indicate deliberate Byzantine engagement and the selective adoption of Christian symbols by Slavic groups. Trade networks played an important role in early exposure. Slavic communities exchanged goods with Byzantine, Frankish, and Avar intermediaries, encountering coins bearing Christian iconography, inscriptions, and imported artifacts. These items transmitted cultural knowledge alongside economic value, familiarizing local populations with Christian concepts and ritual objects. The diffusion of material culture demonstrates how non-missionary contact could influence perception of religion, morality, and political authority. Early Christian ideas also filtered through neighboring Christianized peoples, including the Bulgars, Avars, and Thracian populations. Slavic groups observing liturgical practices, feasting customs, and clerical hierarchy gained awareness of religious structures without adopting them fully. Such indirect transmission allowed Slavs to understand Christian authority, ritual, and cosmology as a social and political framework, preparing communities for eventual integration while maintaining autonomy in belief and practice. Archaeological findings further illuminate the selective adoption of Christian elements. Burials with oriented graves, cross-shaped pendants, or imported chalices appear sporadically alongside traditional cremation and pagan grave goods. This suggests experimental or symbolic incorporation rather than wholesale conversion. Slavic communities could adopt elements that reinforced social cohesion, prestige, or diplomatic alignment without replacing established cosmology and ritual networks. Diplomatic engagement reinforced early contact. Byzantine emperors and envoys sought to influence Slavic leadership through symbolic Christian practices, including ceremonial baptism or church construction near tribal assemblies. Chronicles record instances where Slavic leaders allowed missionaries to operate temporarily, indicating strategic accommodation rather than religious submission. This demonstrates that early Christian contact functioned as both cultural and political negotiation, blending religious exposure with pragmatic governance. The cumulative effect of these interactions was the gradual familiarization of Slavs with Christian thought, ritual, and iconography, long before formal conversion occurred. Communities gained knowledge of liturgical structure, ecclesiastical hierarchy, and symbolic practice, while retaining pre-existing belief systems and ritual patterns. This duality, partial adoption alongside cultural continuity, illustrates the adaptive capacity of Slavic societies and the nuanced process by which external religious influence could take root without immediate systemic transformation. By the late 8th century, the stage was set for formal Christianization. Knowledge acquired through missionary activity, trade, and diplomacy created receptive conditions among elites and communities, smoothing the eventual introduction of organized ecclesiastical structures. The selective incorporation of Christian symbols and ritual elements also highlights the flexibility of Slavic belief systems, which could integrate new religious ideas without destabilizing social cohesion or communal governance. Early Christian contact demonstrates that religious transformation was a gradual, negotiated process. Slavs did not experience immediate conversion but rather a series of incremental exposures, in which material culture, ritual awareness, and political calculation intersected. These formative interactions laid the foundation for the more systematic adoption of Christianity in the 9th century, when leaders such as Prince Rastislav of Moravia or Knyaz Boris I of Bulgaria would formalize faith as a state institution. In conclusion, The pre-conversion period illustrates how religion and diplomacy intersected in shaping Slavic society. Christianity, introduced through missionaries, trade, and neighboring influence, became increasingly present in social consciousness while pagan practice remained dominant. This dual exposure ensured that formal conversion later integrated seamlessly into existing cultural frameworks, demonstrating the adaptability and resilience of Slavic communities in the face of ideological and political change. By mediating early contact through selective adoption, Slavs preserved cultural continuity, maintained social cohesion, and acquired the knowledge necessary to engage with Christian polities. This stage of gradual exposure set the stage for the transformative impact of organized Christianization, which would fundamentally reshape Slavic states, institutions, and identity in the early medieval period. Fields sustained empires. For early Slavic communities, agriculture formed the backbone of daily life and economic stability. Settlement patterns, tools, and land use demonstrate how subsistence strategies enabled both population growth and the foundation for broader trade networks. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence provides detailed insight into crop cultivation, livestock management, and village organization from the 6th through 9th centuries CE. Slavic settlements were primarily village-based, typically composed of semi-subterranean dwellings, storage pits, and communal spaces. Excavations across Central and Eastern Europe reveal clusters of households arranged to maximize arable land while facilitating social cooperation. Fields were cleared using slash-and-burn techniques, especially in forest steppe regions, allowing periodic rotation and soil renewal. Archaeobotanical studies indicate cultivation of cereals such as rye, barley, and millet, alongside legumes and flax, forming a diversified subsistence base adapted to regional climates. Tools were simple but effective, emphasizing functionality for small-scale, kin-based farming. Finds of iron plowshares, sickles, hoes, and grinding stones indicate a mixed economy of tillage, harvesting, and processing. Semi-subterranean dwellings were often accompanied by storage pits for grain and root crops, demonstrating systematic management of surplus. These tools and storage strategies reveal a society capable of sustaining year-round subsistence and buffering against seasonal scarcity. Animal husbandry complemented crop production. Archaeozoological evidence shows that cattle, pigs, goats, and sheep were raised primarily for food, labor, and secondary products such as milk, wool, and hides. Draft animals supported plowing and transport, enhancing productivity in expanding settlements. Seasonal mobility facilitated grazing, allowing communities to exploit both riverine and upland pastures. This integration of agriculture and pastoralism reflects adaptive strategies suited to varied environments across Central and Eastern Europe. Land management was organized communally, consistent with decentralized governance structures. While individual households cultivated assigned plots, rotational use and shared access to pastures and water sources required coordination. Settlement archaeology shows evidence of boundary markers, communal storage, and coordinated crop rotation, suggesting that cooperative planning underpinned both economic and social stability. These arrangements reinforced kinship networks and facilitated collaboration without imposing hierarchical oversight. Agricultural surplus was limited but significant. Beyond sustaining local populations, surplus enabled exchange with neighboring communities and external polities, including Avars, Byzantines, and early Frankish territories. Evidence of traded goods, ceramics, metal tools, and occasionally luxury items demonstrates that surplus production was a prerequisite for Slavic participation in regional trade networks. This economic flexibility allowed communities to engage in both subsistence and market-oriented activity without destabilizing local autonomy. Settlement layout and field systems were shaped by environmental and geographic factors. River valleys provided fertile soil and water access, supporting denser village clusters, while upland or forest steppe regions required more dispersed settlements. Archaeological surveys show adaptation to microenvironments, including terracing, raised fields, and irrigation in select regions, indicating that agricultural practice was responsive to local ecological constraints. These adaptations illustrate how early Slavs maximized land use while maintaining ecological balance. The integration of agriculture with social and religious practices further reinforced cohesion. Seasonal festivals, ritual offerings, and harvest ceremonies linked productive cycles to communal observance, providing structure for labor coordination and reinforcing shared identity. Archaeobotanical and artifact evidence from ritual deposits, including grain, flax, and livestock remains, demonstrates the fusion of subsistence and spiritual life. This relationship between material production and cultural practice strengthened village resilience and continuity over generations. By the 9th century, Slavic agriculture had evolved into a stable and adaptive system, capable of sustaining growing populations and facilitating trade. The combination of small-scale cultivation, pastoral management, and communal organization created both food security and social cohesion. These foundations supported later economic specialization, craft production, and the emergence of proto-urban centers, enabling the transition from subsistence communities to early medieval polities. In conclusion, agriculture was not merely a means of survival but a structuring force for society, linking settlement patterns, kinship organization, and trade potential. Fields sustained communities, enabled surplus exchange, and provided the material basis for social and political development. By integrating environmental adaptation, cooperative management, and ritual observance, early Slavs established an economic framework that would underpin expansion, cultural continuity, and eventual state formation. Rivers connected the Slavic world. From the 6th through 9th centuries CE, waterways such as the Dnieper, Vistula, and Danube formed the backbone of early Slavic trade, linking dispersed communities to one another and to larger European and Eurasian exchange networks. Archaeological, textual, and numismatic evidence demonstrates that riverine trade facilitated not only the movement of goods, but also the diffusion of technology, culture, and political influence. The most prominent commodities included amber, furs, slaves, and agricultural surplus. Amber from the Baltic region traveled along the Vistula and other northern rivers to Byzantine and Frankish markets, often exchanged for luxury goods, metal tools, or coinage. Archaeological finds of Baltic amber in southern Slavic settlements confirm these long-distance networks. Furs, especially from forested zones in Eastern Europe, provided high-value items for both local trade and diplomatic gift-giving, enhancing the material wealth of village clusters and early political centers. Slavic participation in slave trade was both a consequence and a driver of integration. Sources from Byzantine chroniclers, including Theophylact Simocatta, indicate that Slavic groups supplied captives from conflicts or raids, often exchanged along major rivers. This trade provided both economic resources and access to broader markets, linking local production to imperial economies. Archaeological evidence of transport implements, such as dugout canoes and riverine landing sites, supports the practical mechanisms of such exchange. Trade was not confined to long-distance routes. Intervillage and regional exchange circulated foodstuffs, tools, textiles, and craft goods. Semi-subterranean villages often contained imported pottery, iron implements, and luxury ornaments, suggesting active participation in regional markets. These exchanges enhanced social cohesion by creating interdependencies among settlements and provided incentives for coordinated production and surplus management. Rivers also facilitated cultural and technological diffusion. Navigation allowed the spread of metalworking techniques, fortification designs, and ritual artifacts, contributing to a shared material culture across Slavic territories. Hydronyms and toponyms along trade routes indicate a degree of linguistic integration, reflecting both population movement and sustained contact between disparate communities. River networks, therefore, functioned as arteries of both commerce and communication, underpinning social and political cohesion. By connecting Slavic communities to Byzantine, Frankish, and steppe polities, trade networks increased exposure to external political and economic models. Material evidence, including coin hoards and imported ceramics, demonstrates the selective adoption of foreign practices while preserving local autonomy. Slavic groups could participate in exchange networks without forfeiting internal governance structures, highlighting a pattern of economic integration that coexisted with political decentralization. Archaeological surveys of riverine settlements reveal patterns of specialization. Some villages concentrated on animal husbandry or furs, while others produced pottery, textiles, or agricultural surplus for trade. This functional differentiation enhanced inter-village interdependence and encouraged proto-regional coordination, as communities exchanged complementary goods along established routes. Evidence of storage pits, wharves, and rudimentary docks illustrates the infrastructure supporting these networks. Seasonal rhythms structured trade activity. Navigable rivers were most accessible during spring and summer, while frozen winters limited transport but facilitated overland movement using sleds and pack animals. This seasonality influenced production cycles, settlement planning, and social organization, requiring coordination among villages and early tribal leaders. Coordination reinforced collective decision-making and provided practical experience in organizing resources and labor across multiple communities. Trade also shaped early political structures. Communities controlling key river crossings or junctions acquired strategic advantage, enhancing the authority of local leaders and contributing to the development of proto-state centers. Archaeological evidence from fortified settlements along the Dnieper and Danube indicates that these nodes combined defensive capability with economic oversight, integrating commercial and political functions. Control over trade routes increased wealth, encouraged population aggregation, and fostered hierarchical differentiation while maintaining broader communal networks. By the 9th century, Slavic trade networks were extensive, linking the Baltic, Black Sea, and Central European regions. Integration through commerce facilitated the flow of goods, ideas, and social organization, setting the stage for more complex political structures. Hydrological and archaeological evidence demonstrates that rivers were not merely conduits for material exchange. They structured settlement, communication, and emerging authority. In conclusion, river-based trade integrated Slavic communities into regional and interregional networks, enhancing material wealth, technological diffusion, and social cohesion. Commodities such as amber, furs, and agricultural surplus circulated widely, creating interdependencies and incentives for coordinated management. These economic networks provided the foundation for emerging political complexity, demonstrating how trade, geography, and social organization intersected to shape the development of early Slavic society. Economic integration through rivers and exchange networks not only enriched communities but also prepared the ground for centralized leadership and regional coordination, bridging decentralized village structures and the later formation of Slavic polities. Trade, therefore, was both an instrument of material prosperity and a driver of political evolution, linking daily life to the broader trajectory of Slavic expansion and state formation. Quiet innovation sustained expansion. Beyond agriculture and trade, early Slavic communities developed a range of crafts and technological skills that supported settlement stability, economic exchange, and military capacity. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the sophistication of metallurgy, ceramics, textile production, and other domestic industries, reflecting an adaptive and practical approach to material culture. Metallurgy was a cornerstone of technological development. Excavations in Central and Eastern Europe reveal iron tools, knives, axes, and plowshares, which were produced locally or adapted from imported designs. Slavic blacksmiths mastered smelting, forging, and basic alloying, enabling communities to maintain agricultural implements, weaponry, and domestic tools. Archaeometallurgical analysis of slag, furnaces, and workshop debris indicates both small-scale household production and specialized community-level workshops, suggesting a division of labor within settlements. Weapon production was closely linked to metallurgy. Spearheads, arrowheads, and defensive implements appear in both settlement and burial contexts, demonstrating that craft skills underpin the capacity for local defense and military mobilization. Metalworking innovations allowed communities to produce tools that were durable, functional, and adaptable to local environmental conditions. The ability to manufacture and repair weapons locally reduced dependence on external sources and contributed to regional autonomy. Ceramic technology also illustrates Slavic skill and adaptability. Pottery served both domestic and trade functions, with vessels used for storage, cooking, and transport. Excavated kilns and pottery shards indicate wheel-made and hand-modeled techniques, often decorated with incised or stamped motifs. Regional variation in style and production demonstrates localized innovation alongside the diffusion of techniques through trade networks, enabling communities to maintain cultural identity while engaging economically with neighbors. Domestic industries extended to textiles and woodworking. Archaeological finds of loom weights, spindle whorls, and wooden implements indicate household production of cloth, ropes, and other essential materials. These crafts supported everyday life, supplemented subsistence activities, and provided goods for local and regional exchange. Combined with metalworking and ceramics, domestic industries formed a complementary system sustaining settlement economies. Specialized production facilitated participation in wider trade networks. Artifacts such as iron tools, high-quality ceramics, and textile fragments have been recovered along riverine trade routes, including the Dnieper and Vistula corridors. This circulation reflects both economic integration and the practical utility of crafts, providing communities with surplus goods to exchange for luxury items, coins, and foreign technologies. The presence of standardized forms and durable materials suggests a level of organization sufficient to support sustained trade. Innovation was often pragmatic, responding to environmental and social challenges. Metallurgical techniques adapted to local or availability, ceramic forms suited transport and storage needs, and domestic industries adjusted to population density and settlement scale. Such adaptations allowed communities to maintain material stability while expanding geographically. Archaeological evidence of repeated tool forms, repaired implements, and multifunctional artifacts illustrates resource efficiency and technological resilience. The technological base also supported military capacity. Durable iron weapons, reinforced shields, and portable fortifications derived from local craft practices enabled Slavic communities to defend settlements and coordinate in larger coalitions. Production of domestic implements freed labor and resources for seasonal military mobilization. In this way, technological competence was intertwined with both daily subsistence and strategic defense, linking economic innovation directly to political and social resilience. Artisan activity reinforced social cohesion and knowledge transmission. Skills were often learned within kinship networks, passed from generation to generation, and adapted collectively within communities. Workshop organization, material standardization, and communal labor coordination reflect the integration of craft, education, and social structure. This system ensured that technological knowledge remained widespread and transferable, sustaining long-term economic and military capacity. By the 9th century, craft and technological innovation had produced a materially robust and economically flexible society, capable of supporting population growth, regional trade, and political consolidation. Slavic communities leveraged local resources efficiently while integrating selective external technologies, creating durable tools, ceramics, and domestic products essential for expansion and interaction with neighboring polities. In conclusion, Slavic craft and technology provided the practical foundation for both economic stability and strategic capability. Metallurgy, ceramics, and domestic industries maintained subsistence, facilitated trade, and strengthened defense. By integrating innovation with tradition, early Slavs created a resilient material culture that enabled population mobility, expansion, and eventual state formation. Material strength and technological competence thus supported the next phase of development, linking economic production to military organization, regional coordination, and the broader trajectory of political complexity that would emerge in subsequent centuries. The Slavs fought without armies. Prior to the formation of organized polities, military activity among Slavic communities was decentralized, situational, and highly mobile. Archaeological evidence, combined with contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles, indicates that early Slavic groups relied on guerrilla tactics, rapid movement, and locally produced weaponry rather than standing forces or hierarchical command structures. Settlements were typically small and dispersed, a pattern that shaped the tactical approach to warfare. Villages were capable of rapid mobilization, drawing on able-bodied kinship networks to defend territory or conduct raiding operations. Weapons were often multifunctional, including spears, axes, and bows, which could be employed for hunting as well as combat. Excavated arrowheads, spear tips, and simple shields confirm the widespread local production of arms, demonstrating self-sufficiency in basic military needs. Mobility was central to early Slavic warfare. Groups could disperse into forests, marshes, and river valleys to evade superior forces or launch surprise attacks, a strategy that maximized geographic knowledge and minimized vulnerability. Chroniclers, such as Procopius and later Frankish sources, describe Slavic raiding patterns along the Danube and within Byzantine territories, emphasizing hit-and-run tactics and temporary occupation rather than permanent conquest. This approach enabled communities to exploit enemy weaknesses without exposing themselves to prolonged engagement. Tactical organization was flexible and often situational. Leadership during conflict was temporary, typically vested in individuals with demonstrated skill or charisma. These leaders coordinated raids, defense, and negotiation with external powers, but authority remained contextual and non-hereditary. Archaeological surveys of fortified sites suggest that while some villages prepared defensive structures, these were modest, reflecting a preference for adaptive mobility over static defense. Weapons technology reflects both practicality and adaptation to the environment. Iron axes and spears were widely available, while bows allowed harassment from a distance. Finds of sling stones, wooden clubs, and simple shields indicate that craft production supported rapid arming of the population. Weapons were generally suited to small-scale engagements and local terrain, emphasizing versatility over specialization. Such material culture illustrates a tactical doctrine optimized for dispersed communities confronting larger, organized powers. Conflict was also ritualized and integrated into social life. Raiding parties often included symbolic observances or feasting prior to engagement, reflecting the intertwining of martial activity with communal norms. Chronicles note that retaliatory expeditions were common, linking defense, vengeance, and social cohesion. Archaeological evidence of ritual deposits at settlement peripheries, including weapon offerings, suggests that martial practice was both practical and socially codified. Early warfare traditions shaped Slavic expansion. During the 5th to 7th centuries CE, rapid population growth and opportunistic movement into depopulated regions required flexible military capacity. Guerrilla tactics allowed Slavic groups to occupy new territories, establish footholds along river valleys, and resist incursions from Avars, Byzantines, and other neighboring polities. The absence of standing armies did not impede territorial expansion. Rather, it encouraged adaptable, context-specific strategies. These early military practices also facilitated integration with emerging political structures. Temporary coalitions and cooperative defense mechanisms provided a foundation for proto-state organization, as demonstrated in the Confederation of Samo and later regional polities. The ability to mobilize kin-based networks efficiently underscored the practical link between social organization and military capability. By the end of the 7th century, early Slavic warfare had established a pattern of flexible, community-centered defense, capable of responding to environmental challenges, demographic expansion, and external pressures. While lacking formalized armies or hierarchical command, these methods provided sufficient effectiveness to sustain survival, protect settlements, and exploit opportunities for expansion. In conclusion, early Slavic warfare demonstrates that decentralized, adaptable military strategies can be as effective as formal armies in specific ecological and social contexts. Guerrilla tactics, rapid mobilization, and multifunctional weaponry allowed communities to defend territory, conduct raids, and coordinate collective action. These practices provided the groundwork for more organized military systems, linking social cohesion, material production, and tactical innovation to the later emergence of regional power structures. The adaptive, kin-based approach to early conflict illustrates how warfare and community organization were deeply intertwined, setting the stage for the development of coordinated forces and strategic leadership that would define Slavic military activity in subsequent centuries. Wood and earth replaced open villages. As Slavic communities expanded and faced increasing external pressures from Avars, Byzantines, and other neighbors, the architectural landscape of settlements changed. Archaeological evidence indicates that hill forts, ditches, and palisade enclosures emerged as key defensive measures, transforming both the physical and organizational structure of early Slavic society. Hill forts, often located on elevated terrain near rivers or trade routes, combined natural advantages with human-engineered defenses. Excavations in regions such as modern-day Poland, Slovakia, and western Ukraine reveal earthen ramparts reinforced with timber palisades, providing protection against raiding parties and organized military campaigns. The choice of elevated locations reflects both strategic foresight and an understanding of terrain as a force multiplier in local defense. Defensive networks were not isolated structures but often part of regional coordination systems. Settlements linked by visual signaling, rivers, or roadways could communicate threats across multiple villages, enabling collective response. Archaeological surveys show that fortifications were spaced to cover major population centers and control movement along trade or migration corridors, suggesting early forms of integrated territorial management. Construction techniques were practical and locally adapted. Timber framing and compacted earth ramparts allowed rapid assembly using community labor. Post-hole patterns and remains of rivet walls indicate that fortifications were periodically repaired, upgraded, and maintained over generations. These structures served dual functions: physical defense and symbolic demonstration of collective organization and territorial claim. Interior settlement patterns within fortifications illustrate continuity with previous village organization. Semi-subterranean dwellings, storage pits, and communal spaces persisted, demonstrating that defensive construction complemented, rather than replaced, traditional settlement structures. Archaeological evidence also indicates that hill forts sometimes served as centers for trade, craft production, and ritual activity, integrating social, economic, and military functions in a single locus. Fortifications facilitated the coordination of military resources. Enclosed spaces allowed for the assembly of temporary militias, the storage of weapons, and the staging of defensive or offensive operations. Finds of iron weapons, arrowheads, and defensive implements within hill forts demonstrate their role in preparing communities for conflict, while limited traces of siege evidence suggest that these fortifications were primarily deterrents rather than enduring targets of large-scale assault. The evolution of defense systems also reflects the transition from loosely organized raiding groups to proto-state structures. Control over fortified centers enhanced the authority of local leaders and assemblies, allowing for coordinated defense planning, dispute resolution, and resource allocation. In some cases, hill forts became focal points for alliances or confederations, reinforcing social cohesion and regional identity. Regional variation in fortification design demonstrates adaptability to local environments and threat profiles. Lowland settlements frequently relied on moated enclosures or palisade ditches, while highland communities emphasized earthen ramparts and terracing. This adaptability highlights the practical intelligence of Slavic communities in aligning construction techniques with environmental and tactical conditions, balancing labor investment against defensive utility. Archaeological evidence also suggests that fortifications influenced settlement expansion. Communities within or near hill forts could withstand pressure from migrating or raiding neighbors, enabling population aggregation, trade concentration, and proto-urban development. The protective function of these structures contributed to demographic stability, economic growth, and social stratification, setting the stage for centralized leadership and early political integration. By the 8th and 9th centuries CE, fortifications had become a defining feature of Slavic territorial organization, signaling both strategic awareness and emerging political authority. Wood and earth, though ephemeral compared with stone fortresses elsewhere, effectively defended communities while reinforcing social cohesion, resource coordination, and territorial control. In conclusion, early Slavic fortifications illustrate how material adaptation and social organization converged to enhance survival and stability. Hill forts, palisades, and defensive networks were not only military innovations but also instruments of communal identity, leadership consolidation, and territorial management. These defensive measures supported the transition from decentralized villages to politically integrated regions, demonstrating the interplay between environmental adaptation, social cohesion, and proto-state formation. Defense infrastructure thus provided the material and organizational foundation for early Slavic political authority, bridging the gap between flexible kin-based networks and the more centralized polities that would emerge in subsequent centuries. Former raiders became soldiers of empire. As Slavic groups expanded across Central and Southeastern Europe during the 6th through 9th centuries CE, they increasingly came into contact with imperial powers seeking manpower for military campaigns. The Byzantine Empire, facing both external threats and internal manpower shortages, recruited Slavs as mercenaries, auxiliaries, and garrison troops, integrating them into imperial armies while simultaneously influencing their political and military practices. Primary sources, including Theophylact Symacata, Constantine Viis de Administrando Imperio, and Chronicles of Paul the Deacon, provide evidence of Slavic service in Byzantine campaigns. These sources describe units composed of Slavic warriors deployed along the Danube frontier, in Thrace, and in Italy, performing roles ranging from infantry skirmishing to riverine raids. Service was often temporary and contractual, allowing Slavic groups to engage economically and politically without relinquishing their communal autonomy. Archaeological and material evidence supports textual accounts. Weapons recovered from Byzantine frontier forts, including spears, axes, and arrowheads characteristic of Slavic manufacture, indicate that mercenary contingents retained elements of their traditional armament. This blending of indigenous techniques with imperial organization demonstrates the adaptive capacity of Slavic warriors, who could operate within structured armies while preserving tactical flexibility honed through kin-based raids and local defense. Recruitment into imperial armies facilitated exposure to hierarchical command, logistics, and larger-scale military strategy. Slavic warriors learned to coordinate informations, maintain supply lines, and participate in prolonged campaigns, contrasting with earlier guerrilla and raiding practices. This experience enhanced their tactical repertoire and provided a foundation for later military organization within emerging Slavic polities. Leaders who served or commanded contingents often returned with knowledge of Byzantine military administration, fortification practices, and weaponry, contributing to the professionalization of local military structures. Mercenary service also created economic incentives. Payment in coin, land grants, or booty strengthened local communities while linking them to imperial networks. Participation in Byzantine campaigns offered opportunities for social mobility, particularly for ambitious warriors or emerging leaders. Such integration demonstrates how military experience could reinforce both political influence and social prestige within Slavic settlements, further contributing to proto-state formation. The strategic deployment of Slavs within imperial forces reflects the dual function of these groups as both military assets and instruments of frontier stabilization. Byzantine authorities relied on Slavic troops to supplement garrisons, patrol rivers, and conduct punitive expeditions against hostile neighbors. This integration allowed the empire to extend control along volatile frontiers while maintaining cost efficiency, highlighting the practical utility of Slavic military expertise in imperial policy. Slavic participation in imperial armies also had cultural and technological consequences. Soldiers gained familiarity with armored cavalry, siege techniques, and organized encampments, which contrasted with earlier village-based defensive methods. Upon returning home, these veterans introduced new military knowledge, reinforcing fortification construction, militia organization, and strategic coordination within their communities. This transfer of expertise accelerated the development of structured military hierarchies that underpinned emerging regional authorities. Moreover, service in Byzantine forces fostered diplomatic connections. Slavic leaders who supplied troops could negotiate treaties, secure favorable trade arrangements, and assert influence over subordinate groups. Military contribution became a form of political leverage, allowing communities to participate in the regional balance of power while preserving autonomy. Archaeological evidence of fortified settlements with Byzantine-influenced design elements supports the diffusion of imperial practices into local contexts. By the 9th century, Slavic service in imperial armies had become a widespread phenomenon, linking raiding and frontier experience with organized military engagement. Formerly decentralized communities gained exposure to large-scale strategy, discipline, and logistical planning, laying the groundwork for the emergence of centralized leadership and professionalized military units. This period illustrates the dynamic interplay between external empires and local communities in shaping political and martial evolution. In conclusion, The integration of Slavic warriors into Byzantine military structures demonstrates how experience in imperial service contributed directly to the development of regional authority. Former raiders transformed into trained soldiers, acquiring skills in strategy, fortification, and coordination that would influence both local defense and emerging statecraft. The combination of external exposure, economic incentive, and tactical learning created a foundation upon which later Slavic rulers could consolidate power, demonstrating the link between military experience and the trajectory of early political formation. Military service thus bridged the gap between kin-based raiding communities and organized polities, highlighting the adaptive capacity of Slavs to absorb foreign practices while retaining autonomy. The skills, networks, and resources gained through imperial engagement would directly inform the formation of early Slavic states and the subsequent organization of regional military power. Steppe and forest merged. The formation of the First Bulgarian Empire in the late 7th century illustrates the convergence of nomadic and Slavic societal models, producing a polity that combined military discipline, administrative structure, and local cultural practices. The Bulgars, a Turkic-speaking steppe elite, settled in the lower Danube region, encountering dense Slavic populations who had expanded across the Balkans in previous centuries. Integration between the two groups created a new political and social synthesis that shaped state development in Eastern Europe. Historical sources, including Theophanes the Confessor and Nicephorus I, describe how Bulgar rulers relied on existing Slavic settlements and leadership structures to consolidate control. Archaeological evidence confirms that Slavic villages continued agricultural production, maintained local defensive works, and participated in regional trade, while Bulgar elites provided military organization and centralized authority. This combination allowed the new state to expand efficiently, securing key river valleys, fortifications, and trade nodes. The synthesis extended beyond military and administrative integration to language, culture, and law. Early inscriptions and later charters indicate that Bulgar rulers adopted Slavic linguistic conventions for official communication, while Slavic communities gradually accepted the authority of the steppe elite. Archaeological finds, including ceramics, weaponry, and settlement layouts, demonstrate continuity in Slavic material culture alongside elite markers of Bulgar identity, reflecting a negotiated blending of traditions. The Bulgarian state also institutionalized military organization, drawing on both Bulgar cavalry expertise and Slavic infantry traditions. Steppe-style mounted units provided rapid mobility and offensive capacity, while Slavic militia reinforced local defense and maintained control over rural settlements. This combined force structure enabled both territorial expansion and internal stability, highlighting the mutually reinforcing nature of cultural and military synthesis. Religious and ceremonial integration played a crucial role in social cohesion. Prior to formal Christianization in the 9th century under Knyaz Boris I, pagan Slavic and Bulgar practices coexisted. Archaeological evidence of ritual deposits, burial rites, and sacred sites suggests selective accommodation, whereby Bulgar authority was reinforced by Slavic social structures without immediate imposition of foreign ritual systems. The synthesis thus extended to ideological as well as material and political spheres. Economic and administrative strategies also reflected the merged society. Bulgar rulers adopted existing Slavic agricultural networks, riverine trade routes, and craft production centers to support the state's fiscal base. River systems like the Danube, Iskar, and Maritsa facilitated movement of tribute, trade goods, and military personnel. Settlement surveys indicate that Slavic villages retained local governance for daily administration, while overarching taxation and conscription were coordinated through Bulgar oversight. This division of labor created both efficiency and resilience, allowing the state to expand without destabilizing local communities. The synthesis produced a durable model of state formation in which steppe and forest traditions were mutually reinforcing. Bulgar military hierarchy provided central authority, while Slavic social networks ensured continuity of population, labor, and culture. Archaeological analysis of fortifications, metalwork, and ceramics demonstrates that this integration was not superficial, but involved deep structural coordination across multiple domains of society. This model influenced neighboring regions. The Bulgarian state's combination of centralized leadership, regional integration, and accommodation of Slavic social structures provided a template for subsequent polities in Moravia, Kievan Rus, and other emerging Slavic states. Diplomatic contacts with Byzantium, including treaties and missionary missions, further reinforced this model, demonstrating how synthesis of diverse cultural traditions could underpin political legitimacy and expansion. By the early 9th century, the First Bulgarian Empire had established itself as a regional power, consolidating Slavic and Bulgar populations into a coherent political entity capable of projecting influence, maintaining internal stability, and integrating diverse economic and cultural systems. The success of this synthesis highlights the importance of negotiated accommodation, adaptive governance, and strategic incorporation of pre-existing social networks in early state formation. In conclusion, the Bulgarian example illustrates that statehood among the Slavs was not imposed solely by external models, but emerged through the selective integration of nomadic and indigenous practices. Military organization, administrative coordination, cultural accommodation, and economic continuity combined to produce a resilient polity. Steppe and forest merged, creating a political framework capable of expansion, diplomacy, and eventual Christianization, setting a precedent for subsequent Slavic polities across Eastern Europe. The Bulgarian synthesis demonstrates that the formation of Slavic states was a process of adaptation and incorporation, where external influence was mediated through local structures, and political authority was legitimized through cooperation with existing social networks. This period establishes a foundation for the spread of state models and organized governance throughout the Slavic world. Faith became political. In the late 8th and 9th centuries CE, the emergence of Great Moravia illustrates how governance and religion became intertwined in the consolidation of early Slavic polities in Central Europe. Stretching across parts of present-day Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Western Hungary, Great Moravia represented a coordinated political entity that integrated Slavic communities under centralized leadership while adopting Christianity as a tool for social cohesion and international legitimacy. Historical sources, particularly Annals Regni Francorum and writings of Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, indicate that Moravian rulers employed both secular and ecclesiastical structures to maintain authority. Prince Majmir I and his successors organized settlements into hierarchically subordinate districts, with fortified centers serving as administrative hubs. Archaeological surveys of hill forts and fortified sites, such as Mykulsis and Stare Mesto, confirm the presence of centralized settlements capable of housing elite leadership, garrisons, and craft production. These fortifications reflect a deliberate strategy to project power and protect vital economic and political infrastructure. Christianity played a critical role in consolidating state authority. The mission of Cyril and Methodius, 863 to 867 CE, introduced the Glagolitic script and liturgical translation into Old Church Slavonic, enabling religious practices to be conducted in the vernacular. This linguistic adaptation reinforced political integration by connecting local populations to the ruling elite while creating a shared ideological framework. Conversion was gradual, mediated by local elites, and often aligned with strategic interests, such as alliances with the Frankish Empire or diplomatic recognition from Constantinople. Administration in Great Moravia combined inherited Slavic organizational structures with Christian clerical oversight. Village assemblies and kinship networks continued to manage local affairs, while ecclesiastical authorities supervised religious observances, education, and legal codification. Archaeological evidence of church foundations, associated burials, and imported liturgical artifacts indicates that religious institutions became central to urban planning and social regulation. This integration of secular and ecclesiastical authority illustrates how faith functioned as a political instrument to legitimize leadership and coordinate regional governance. Military organization in Great Moravia reflected both continuity with earlier Slavic practices and adaptation to emerging state needs. Fortified centers housed militia trained in defense of river valleys and trade routes, while centralized coordination allowed for coordinated responses to external threats from Franks, Bulgars, or Avars. Archaeological finds of weaponry, such as spears, axes, and arrowheads, within fortified sites confirm that local forces could be mobilized effectively, combining traditional infantry tactics with strategic oversight from the ruling elite. Trade and economic integration supported both governance and religious expansion. River networks, including the Morava and Danube, facilitated the movement of agricultural surplus, craft goods, and ecclesiastical supplies. Imported ceramics, metal objects, and coinage suggest participation in regional markets, while local production centers supplied both everyday needs and religious infrastructure. Economic stability allowed rulers to sponsor church construction, fund military activity, and maintain diplomatic networks, further intertwining material resources with political authority. Cultural synthesis reinforced state cohesion. While Christian institutions were introduced, pre-existing Slavic social and ritual practices persisted, often incorporated into festivals, settlement layouts, or legal customs. This continuity reduced social disruption while enabling elites to exercise moral and legal influence through new religious frameworks. Archaeological evidence of hybrid burial practices and ritual deposits demonstrates that integration of Christian elements occurred gradually and pragmatically, rather than by wholesale imposition. Great Moravia's example also illustrates the geopolitical dimensions of religion. Conversion aligned the polity with Byzantium or Rome, facilitating diplomatic recognition and access to ecclesiastical resources, including clerics, manuscripts, and liturgical artifacts. Political use of faith strengthened both internal cohesion and external legitimacy, demonstrating how ideological frameworks became inseparable from state formation. The process of Christianization thus contributed not only to spiritual life but to administrative centralization and elite consolidation. By the end of the 9th century, Great Moravia had established a durable model for Central European Slavic states. Centralized governance, fortified settlements, and Christian institutions created a cohesive structure capable of withstanding external pressures and organizing internal resources efficiently. The integration of faith, political authority, and social networks provided a template for neighboring regions, including the later development of Bohemia, Moravia, and other early Slavic polities. In conclusion, Great Moravia demonstrates how religion became a mechanism of political consolidation. Faith, administration, and military organization were mutually reinforcing, enabling local rulers to integrate dispersed settlements, coordinate economic and military activity, and establish diplomatic legitimacy. Christianization was not merely spiritual. It was a tool for governance, identity formation, and statecraft. The experience of Great Moravia set a precedent for Eastern Slavs, who would follow parallel paths of integrating centralized authority, military organization, and Christian institutions. By combining faith with governance, the polity exemplifies how ideological and material structures coalesce to produce durable early medieval Slavic states, linking local autonomy with broader regional influence. Rivers built a state. The formation of Kievan Rus in the late 9th and 10th centuries CE exemplifies the synthesis of Slavic communities with Varangian, Viking, elites along the Dnieper, Fokhov, and Western Bug River systems. The convergence of local agricultural populations with mobile warrior administrators created a polity capable of coordinating trade, military activity, and centralized governance across a vast and diverse landscape. Historical accounts, particularly the primary chronicle, Povest Vremenik Let, describe the invitation of Varangian leaders such as Rurik to establish authority over local Slavic tribes. While the narrative is partly legendary, archaeological evidence supports the presence of Scandinavian-style fortifications, burial goods, and imported trade items in Novgorod, Kiev, and other riverine centers. These findings indicate that Varangian elites brought administrative expertise, martial organization, and long-distance trade networks, which integrated with existing Slavic settlements. The river system was the backbone of the emerging state. Major waterways functioned as highways for commerce, communication, and military deployment. The Dnieper, in particular, connected Slavic settlements to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire, facilitating the flow of furs, wax, honey, slaves, and luxury imports. Settlement patterns along these rivers demonstrate strategic placement of fortified centers to monitor traffic, collect tribute, and provide safe anchorage for riverine expeditions. Archaeological remains of wharves, palisades, and storage facilities confirm that river control was central to both economic and political consolidation. Military integration combined Slavic and Varangian practices. Local militias supplemented professional Varangian units, blending infantry mobilization with cavalry and naval raiding capabilities. Weapons recovered from fortified sites, including spears, axes, and arrowheads, indicate a hybrid approach. Slavic infantry traditions were reinforced by Varangian tactical knowledge and disciplined coordination. This military synthesis enabled both internal control and effective campaigns against neighboring polities, including the Khazars, Pecheneg, and Byzantine forces. Administrative structures reflected Varangian influence while retaining Slavic foundations. Urban centers such as Kiev, Novgorod, and Smolensk functioned as political and economic hubs, with local Slavic assemblies contributing to decision-making alongside Varangian leadership. Tribute collection, tax administration, and judicial oversight were organized hierarchically, yet accommodated traditional social structures in surrounding villages. Material evidence, including early coinage, imported ceramics, and fortified settlements, demonstrates coordinated governance across an extensive and diverse territory. Trade integration was a defining feature of Kievan Rus. River routes enabled direct contact with Byzantium, the Caspian region, and Scandinavia, positioning the state as a commercial intermediary. Archaeological finds of Byzantine silver, Arabic dirhams, and Scandinavian metalwork within Kievan Rus settlements indicate robust long-distance exchange, while local craft specialization supplied goods for both domestic and export markets. This economic integration underpinned political authority and facilitated the projection of influence over dispersed populations. Cultural synthesis accompanied political and economic integration. Slavic populations contributed language, agricultural knowledge, and social structures, while Varangian elites introduced administrative practices, fortification techniques, and martial traditions. Religious developments began in this period as well. Initial contact with Byzantine Christianity, combined with existing Slavic pagan practices, set the stage for later Christianization under Vladimir the Great in the late 10th century. Archaeological evidence of hybrid ritual sites and early churches indicates gradual adaptation rather than immediate imposition. The development of Kievan Rus demonstrates the importance of strategic geography, trade, and military synthesis in early state formation. River control enabled centralized coordination across dispersed settlements, while the combination of Slavic social networks and Varangian administrative expertise created an adaptive governance model. Fortifications, tribute collection, and coordinated defense facilitated both internal stability and external projection of power. By the 10th century, Kievan Rus had emerged as a regional hegemon, integrating economic, military, and political systems to maintain authority over a vast territory. The river-based network enabled efficient communication, resource distribution, and defense, while cultural synthesis fostered social cohesion across diverse populations. This integration laid the groundwork for peak power and territorial expansion in subsequent decades. In conclusion, Kievan Rus exemplifies how geography, culture, and external influence converge to produce durable state structures. The combination of Slavic agricultural communities and Varangian leadership created a polity capable of coordinating trade, military activity, and governance across extensive territory. Rivers provided both economic and strategic arteries, while cultural synthesis reinforced political legitimacy and social cohesion. This period established the foundations for Kievan Rus as a major power in Eastern Europe, linking earlier patterns of Slavic settlement, fortification, and trade to centralized authority. Military and administrative experience, combined with economic networks and cultural integration, positioned the state for the peak of political, military, and cultural influence that would define the following centuries. Unity dissolved. By the late 11th century, several Slavic states that had once maintained centralized authority began experiencing political fragmentation, driven by internal decentralization, dynastic disputes, and the pressures of territorial expansion. Kievan Rus, Great Moravia, and other regional polities exemplify the challenges of sustaining cohesion across dispersed settlements, diverse populations, and competing elite networks. In Kievan Rus, the system of appanage succession accelerated division. Rulers divided lands among sons or close relatives, creating semi-autonomous principalities. Primary sources, including the Primary Chronicle, describe disputes over Kiev, Novgorod, and other major cities, resulting in localized centers of power that often acted independently or in opposition to one another. Archaeological evidence shows fortified regional centers maintaining their own garrisons and trade networks, suggesting that political authority had shifted from a single central administration to a network of semi-sovereign polities. Economic decentralization accompanied this political fragmentation. Tribute collection, taxation, and resource allocation, previously coordinated through centralized structures, became increasingly localized. River trade routes remained vital, but control over movement of goods often reflected regional authority rather than overarching state oversight. Material evidence, including regional variations in coinage, imported goods, and craft production, demonstrates that economic networks adapted to localized control, reinforcing independent political units. Social structures mirrored political fragmentation. Local assemblies, kin-based councils, and communal decision-making retained importance, sometimes competing with the authority of princes. The persistence of traditional Slavic governance structures within principalities facilitated autonomy but limited the capacity for coordinated response to external threats. Archaeological evidence of hill forts, palisade settlements, and regional militias indicates that communities increasingly relied on local defense mechanisms rather than centralized military organization. External pressures exacerbated internal division. Neighboring powers, including the Byzantines, Poles, Hungarians, and nomadic steppe groups, exploited the fragmentation of Slavic states, conducting raids, negotiating treaties with individual principalities, or asserting influence through military alliances. Fragmented authority reduced the ability of Slavic rulers to coordinate defense, leaving border regions vulnerable to incursions and destabilizing trade routes. Historical records, such as the Byzantine chronicles and Frankish accounts, emphasize the opportunistic nature of these interventions, highlighting the strategic consequences of decentralization. Religious institutions also played a role in mediating or reinforcing fragmentation. The spread of Christianity, previously a unifying force, became differentiated along regional lines. Bishops and clerics often aligned with local princes rather than a centralized hierarchy, creating parallel networks of authority that could both support and challenge secular rulers. Archaeological evidence, including regional church foundations and localized liturgical artifacts, demonstrates that ecclesiastical influence became increasingly contingent on local political structures. The fragmentation of early Slavic states illustrates broader patterns of political evolution in decentralized societies. Geographic dispersion, kinship-based authority, and resource distribution created structural conditions in which centralized power was difficult to sustain. Combined with dynastic division and external pressure, these factors resulted in a mosaic of principalities that, while maintaining cultural continuity, operated with considerable autonomy. By the early 12th century, political fragmentation had become the defining characteristic of former centralized Slavic polities. Semi-autonomous principalities exercised independent military, economic, and administrative functions, while coordination at a super-regional level became sporadic and contingent. This period of decentralization set the stage for subsequent challenges, including intensified external invasions, internal conflict, and the eventual decline of centralized authority across the Slavic world. In conclusion, political fragmentation demonstrates how internal succession practices, geographic distribution, and decentralized governance structures contributed to the dissolution of unified Slavic states. Localized authority, semi-sovereign principalities, and the persistence of traditional social structures weakened central power, leaving communities exposed to external influence. This process marked the first stage of decline, creating conditions in which military pressure, economic disruption, and social decentralization would interact to reshape the Slavic political landscape in the subsequent centuries. The steppe struck again. Following centuries of internal fragmentation, Slavic principalities faced renewed pressure from nomadic groups originating in the Eurasian steppe, including the Pecheneg, Cumans, and, later, the Mongols. These incursions disrupted trade, depopulated territories, and tested the military capacities of decentralized Slavic polities, forcing adaptations that would reshape social, political, and cultural organization. The Pecheneg, active from the late 10th through the 11th centuries, conducted raids along the Danube, Dnieper, and southern Russian plains. Contemporary Byzantine and Rus chronicles describe fast-moving mounted detachments attacking villages, fortresses, and riverine settlements. Archaeological evidence, including burned settlement layers and hastily reconstructed fortifications, corroborates textual sources, indicating that communities relied on both defensive works and temporary militia mobilization to resist these incursions. Pecheneg activity disrupted trade routes, particularly those connecting Kievan Rus with Byzantium, forcing regional rulers to negotiate tribute payments and military alliances to mitigate losses. By the 12th century, the Cumans, Kipchaks, expanded westward, exerting pressure on the steppes north of the Black Sea. Cumans engaged in both raiding and alliance building, occasionally serving as mercenaries for Slavic princes but often exploiting political fragmentation. Archaeological finds of burial mounds, kurgans, and weapon caches in steppe border regions demonstrate their military presence and influence. The Cumans' mobility, horse-based warfare, and strategic raids exposed the vulnerabilities of decentralized principalities, prompting the construction of more robust fortifications and the development of cavalry contingents within Slavic forces. The Mongol invasions of the early 13th century represented the most transformative challenge. Beginning with the campaigns of Batı Khan in 1237 to 1240, Mongol forces systematically overran principalities of Kievan Rus, destroying urban centers, agricultural infrastructure, and regional fortresses. Chronicles such as the Hypatian Codex document the fall of major cities including Kiev, Pereyaslav, and Vladimir, emphasizing both the speed and organization of Mongol military operations. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, showing layers of destruction, depopulation, and subsequent settlement reorganization. Steppe invasions had profound demographic and political consequences. Repeated raids and occupations depopulated key territories, disrupted local governance, and reduced economic productivity. Principalities became tributary entities under steppe overlords, particularly in the Mongol period, introducing a system of external oversight that constrained autonomy while maintaining local administrative structures. This imposed hierarchy required adaptation by Slavic rulers, who balanced tribute obligations with the maintenance of internal authority. Cultural and social adaptation was equally significant. Communities reinforced defensive settlements, organized regional militias, and developed rapid communication networks along rivers and trade routes. Steppe incursions encouraged alliances between principalities, even when political unity remained limited, demonstrating the capacity for cooperative defense in response to external threats. Archaeological evidence of fortified towns and revised settlement patterns indicates a strategic response to persistent nomadic pressure. Military innovation accompanied these changes. The Slavs increasingly incorporated light cavalry, scouting units, and rapid response forces, drawing both from previous Varangian experience and observation of steppe tactics. Weapon production, including composite bows and mounted armaments, reflects adoption of steppe-influenced technology. Such adaptations highlight the interplay between external military pressure and internal structural evolution, illustrating how decentralized societies respond to highly mobile opponents. Economically, invasions disrupted trade networks, particularly along the Dnieper and Volga rivers. Tribute payments, looting, and population displacement reduced surplus production, while urban centers suffered destruction of craft and storage facilities. However, long-term adaptations included the relocation of settlements to defensible locations, the fortification of key trade hubs, and the strategic negotiation of tribute with nomadic groups. These measures demonstrate a resilient, adaptive response to environmental and military instability. By the mid-13th century, steppe incursions had reshaped both governance and identity. Political fragmentation persisted, but external pressures encouraged the consolidation of defensive strategies, the emergence of regional power centers, and the integration of military innovation into social structures. Surviving principalities retained cultural continuity while absorbing lessons from steppe warfare, creating a hybridized model of defense and administration that would influence Eastern European state development for centuries. In conclusion, the invasions of the Pecheneg, Cumans, and Mongols demonstrate that external military pressures can act as catalysts for social, political, and technological adaptation. Decentralized Slavic communities survived repeated disruptions by integrating fortification, militia organization, and strategic alliances into local governance. Steppe incursions not only challenged territorial control but also transformed military, economic, and political systems, reshaping the trajectory of Slavic societies and laying the groundwork for later resilience and consolidation in Eastern Europe. Words outlasted empires. Despite centuries of political fragmentation, invasions, and cultural assimilation, Slavic languages persisted across Eastern, Western, and Southern Europe, maintaining continuity with their Proto-Slavic origins. Linguistic analysis reveals shared phonological, morphological, and lexical patterns that trace back to the Late Bronze Age, demonstrating the resilience of Slavic identity independent of political consolidation. Comparative linguistics provides the primary framework for understanding this continuity. Features such as consonant palatalization, vowel reduction, and specific verb conjugations appear consistently across East Slavic, West Slavic, and South Slavic branches, suggesting a coherent ancestral system. The distribution of hydronyms, toponyms, and ethnonyms further supports continuity, with rivers, settlements, and regions retaining Slavic-derived names despite changes in political control. These linguistic markers indicate cultural persistence even in territories affected by invasions or foreign administration. Manuscript evidence from the 9th and 10th centuries illustrates active literary and administrative adaptation. The development of the Glagolitic and Cyrillic scripts, introduced by Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius, facilitated the transcription of Slavic languages for religious and bureaucratic purposes. Documents in Old Church Slavonic provided standardized written forms, enabling ecclesiastical and cultural communication across diverse polities. Archaeological finds of inscriptions, liturgical codices, and marginalia corroborate the widespread use of Slavic language in both sacred and secular contexts, demonstrating the capacity of communities to preserve and transmit their linguistic heritage. Regional divergence did not erode underlying continuity. Eastern Slavs developed dialects in Novgorod, Kiev, and Vladimir Suzdal that incorporated local phonetic shifts, while Western Slavs in Poland, Bohemia, and Moravia adopted orthographic conventions influenced by Latin script and ecclesiastical administration. Southern Slavs, particularly in Bulgaria, Serbia, and Croatia, integrated Byzantine linguistic elements while preserving core Slavic vocabulary and grammatical structures. These adaptations illustrate dynamic survival, whereby languages evolved to meet administrative, liturgical, and social needs without losing foundational characteristics. Cultural practices reinforced linguistic continuity. Oral traditions, folklore, and epic poetry served as vectors for transmitting language across generations. Archaeological evidence of seasonal ritual sites, communal feasts, and ceremonial objects supports the persistence of Slavic symbolic frameworks. These cultural practices, often mediated through kin-based and village structures, preserved vernacular communication, social norms, and collective memory in a manner independent of formal political institutions. The resilience of language facilitated the maintenance of identity across centuries of political upheaval. Even when principalities fell under foreign domination, such as Mongol suzerainty in Eastern Europe, Hungarian influence in the West, or Byzantine overlordship in the South, Slavic speech remained a unifying marker of cultural belonging. Linguistic continuity enabled networks of trade, diplomacy, and marriage to persist across politically fragmented landscapes, sustaining communal cohesion and regional distinctiveness. Educational and religious institutions played a critical role in reinforcing Slavic linguistic heritage. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and scribal workshops maintained literary production, codified legal norms, and transmitted religious texts in Slavic vernaculars. The integration of literacy with vernacular languages strengthened the cultural durability of Slavic societies, ensuring that knowledge and collective memory could survive disruptions caused by warfare, migration, or political instability. By the late medieval period, Slavic languages were firmly entrenched across a broad geographic area, providing continuity even as political boundaries shifted. Linguistic survival demonstrates that identity is maintained not solely through centralized governance or empire, but through persistent communication, cultural practice, and social transmission. This continuity allowed Slavic societies to retain cohesion despite fragmentation, external invasions, and regional divergence. In conclusion, the survival of Slavic languages and cultural frameworks underscores the enduring legacy of early Slavic societies. Words and speech outlasted empires, serving as a medium for identity, administration, and cultural expression. Linguistic and cultural continuity facilitated the integration of successive generations, ensuring that the Slavs remained a cohesive cultural and social entity across centuries of political change. This continuity establishes the foundation for the subsequent perpetuation of Slavic identity, linking early settlement, migration, and state formation with the linguistic and cultural realities of the modern Slavic world. It demonstrates that while empires may rise and fall, language and culture provide the most durable markers of societal persistence, shaping the collective memory and historical trajectory of a people. Before we continue exploring the enduring legacy of the Slavs, subscribe to Nightfall History and click the bell icon to receive daily deep dives into civilizations and empires. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know which part of Slavic history fascinates you most. Your engagement helps us continue producing detailed, research-driven documentaries, guiding viewers through the full arc of human history.